Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku unlocked the power of Myriad. Here is short summary. When Izuku receives One for All 2 weeks early, he doesn't expect it to knock him out. He especially doesn't expect it to awaken something that had been waiting in his very soul for that moment. Now he has much more than just One for All at his disposal. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Yagi Toshinori, better known as All Might, didn't know what was happening, but it worried him greatly, making him race across the rooftops of Musudafu towards UA High at a breakneck pace, his young successor shivering and twitching in his arms, his now muscular body sweating heavily. Midoriya Izuku had surpassed the blonde hero's expectations by completing the training he'd been assigned a full 2 weeks early. When Toshinori had arrived at Dagoba Beach that morning to find the entire beach, which had once been more of a landfill than the tourist spot it was supposed to be, completely pristine, he'd felt amazed by his 15-year-old protege's achievement. He'd fully expected it to take the lad till the UA entrance exam to actually finish, leaving him little time to get used to the power he was preparing himself to wield. But apparently the Greenette was determined to shatter every expectation the veteran hero had of him by managing to clean even outside of the intended area early. The pride Toshinori felt for the boy he'd chosen to inherit his quirk and mantle was immense, and he'd immediately proceeded to perform the transfer by having Izuku swallow some of his hair. Everything had seemed fine at first as they waited for the hair to be digested, giving the quirkless boy a power to call his own. Toshinori had intended to take advantage of the extra time afforded by the weeks before the exam to give Izuku some combat training to both give him a fighting style and get him used to the immense stress One for All would put on his body, but then things had gone wrong. A couple of hours after Izuku had swallowed the hair, when Toshinori was teaching the boy the proper way to throw a punch, though the boy already knew a surprising amount, his fanboy tendencies giving him some working knowledge that Toshinori thought would serve him well, Izuku suddenly fell to his knees, sweat enveloping him. He began to shake as he went pale, and he looked up at the surprised hero in confusion and no small amount of fear before passing out without a word on the sand he'd worked so hard to clean. After a moment of surprise, Toshinori had immediately checked the boy's pulse, which was racing, and his temperature, which was highly elevated. These facts dumbfounded and worried him, because he'd never heard of any of the previous wielders of One for All having such a reaction when they'd received it. If Izuku hadn't been quirkless, he'd have assumed it was a bad reaction of some sort to his original quirk, even though that didn't really make sense either. Still, the boy needed help, and there was only one medical professional that he'd trust with such a sensitive matter. Thus, after a moment to hit the emergency medical alarm on his phone, he'd picked Izuku up and rushed away. Soon enough he landed at one of UA's side entrances to find the school nurse, Shuzenji Chio, also known as Recovery Girl, waiting for him. "What have you done to yourself this time, All Might?" she barked, though her gaze immediately fell to the teen in the man's arms, turning and motioning for him to follow. "It's not me, Recovery Girl. It's young Midoriya here." He collapsed out of nowhere after going very pale and beginning to sweat, and he's shaking and twitching a lot. His pulse is erratic, and he's burning up. All Might reported, knowing that it would be best to give her the pertinent health information he'd gathered first before explaining the full situation. "Why did you bring him to me instead of to the hospital?" Chio asked as she entered her infirmary, and Toshinori set the boy on one of the beds, the short elder immediately going to work. "And do you have any idea as to the cause?" "The cause is the reason that I can't take him to a normal hospital," Toshinori said as he let his muscle form fade, leaving his true, skeletal form looking down at Izuku worriedly. "This happened shortly after I transferred One for All to him. I'd say at about the point I would expect it to be metabolized and assimilated." Chio paused, glancing at him before humming. "So this is the one you chose," she turned back to Izuku. "I see. Yes, it's best you came to me in that case." She hooked Izuku up to one of her monitors and began to study the readings. "Leave him to me, Toshinori. Go rest up, you look like you need it. Nezu should be here soon to find out what's going on after receiving the message." Toshinori sighed but did as told, knowing better than to get in the woman's way when she was with a patient, no matter how worried he was. He knew that if something happened to Izuku it would be his fault. Not only would one for all likely be irrevocably lost, but so would the life of an innocent boy who'd trusted him and only wanted to help others. Taking a seat outside of the infirmary, he glanced over when he noticed Nezu, the principal of UA High, approach. The diminutive chimera of a dog, mouse and bear stopped beside Toshinori, looking up at the man with his dark, intelligent eyes. "I received the medical emergency alert, but I see you are fine, so I'm assuming that you brought someone into Recovery Girl and she's currently seeing to them." Toshinori nodded before explaining what had happened to the best of his ability, knowing that Nezu's superior intelligence granted by his quirk, high spec, might be able to give Toshinori a better idea of what was going on. Nezu rubbed his chin thoughtfully once Toshinori finished, his long tail swishing behind him. "And you say the boy is quirkless?" The principal asked for clarification. "Diagnosed at age 4, Toshinori said with a nod. "I checked his records myself, just to do my due diligence." Nezu hummed in approval. "I can't think of what might have caused this yet. I'll need to wait for Chio to finish with the lad and see what she comes up with so I have more information." Toshinori nodded, feeling tired and stressed. What was meant to be a day of celebration, when the burning torch was passed on to the next generation to nurture, had gone horribly wrong. Hours passed in silence, Toshinori sitting with his fingers interlaced in front of his face, a maelstrom of thoughts swirling in his mind. Whenever he glanced at Nezu, who had taken a seat beside him, he found the chimera going through Izuku's records on his phone, looking for anything that might indicate as to the cause of the boy's collapse. Toshinori had already seen most of it, including school and medical records. Izuku was unremarkable on paper, from a normal family that didn't stand out. The only thing that stuck out was the fact he was part of the dwindling 20% of humanity without a quirk. That and his involvement in the sludge villain incident almost 10 months before, which was what had brought him to Toshinori's attention in the first place. Still, Nezu had an impressive information network, as appropriate for a pro-hero that excelled at tactics, strategy and information gathering. It wasn't impossible for the principal to find something of interest, no matter how much Toshinori doubted there was anything to find. It was as the third hour of waiting came to a close that Chio walked out of the infirmary, looking tired and perplexed. Toshinori couldn't help but tense. "As young Midoriya?" he asked, afraid yet hopeful. "He'll live, from what I can tell. Something is definitely odd about him." However, after another moment of thought she motioned for the two of them to enter the infirmary and walked back in, Toshinori and Nezu following. When they reached Izuku's bedside, Toshinori helped Nezu up onto a chair so that the principal could study the boy for himself. Toshinori immediately noticed a change in the boy's body when his eyes landed on him. Chio had removed Izuku's shirt to better work on him, leaving him in only his shorts, his muscular torso visible. Toshinori's eyes narrowed as he spotted what appeared to be lines in patterns similar to computer circuits crisscrossing his body, fading in and out of view rhythmically. When the blonde reached out to experimentally touch one of the lines, he found it exuding a surprising amount of heat. "What the?" "Yes, that's just one of the things that's puzzling me about your protege, Toshinori," Chio said somewhat dryly as she turned to her computer, bringing up the results of her tests, along with Izuku's medical history. "Those patterns, those circuits, appeared suddenly with a surge of heat I worried would seriously damage the boy. They seem to be establishing themselves as a sort of secondary nervous system throughout his body. But there's more happening to him." Nezu turned his analytical gaze from the teen on the bed to the school nurse. "Such as, his muscles are becoming denser than they naturally could in a baseline human," she said seriously, baseline human being the medically accepted term for quirkless individuals, for obvious reasons. "His joints are changing as well, in what way I can't exactly say at the moment. If he wasn't unconscious he'd probably be experiencing quite a bit of pain due to those changes alone, but there's still more." Toshinori ran his fingers through his hair at that. "Like what?" "Something is happening to his skin, focused on his hands and the soles of his feet, though the rest is affected as well. It's still too early for me to tell what it is. And whatever is happening is also affecting his brain." She turned the screen of her computer to show them the brain scan she'd done, pointing to a particular area that was showing increased activity. This is the part of the brain that deals with sound. I have no earthly clue what could be causing it to go into overdrive like this. She sighed. All in all, this boy is going through a lot of changes, and I have a feeling they aren't done yet. And then there's this. She moved a tray over, letting the other two heroes see an odd, blocky, black handgun. This appeared clutched in his hand while I wasn't looking about an hour ago, and it caused me pain when I tried to take it from him with my hands. I had to use some specialized equipment to put it on this tray. Toshinori and Nezu observed the gun before glancing at each other, mystified. Some sort of projection? The blonde asked the chimera. Nezu shook his head, unsure, before turning his attention back to Chiyo. Is his life in any danger? Nezu asked calmly as he observed the computer monitor's image. Chiyo hesitated. I don't believe so, but I can't say that with absolute certainty. I think it's best that he stay here till whatever is happening passes, however long that may be. You have no idea why this is happening? Toshinori asked. I haven't heard of any of my predecessors experiencing anything similar, after all. Nezu spoke up. I believe that one for all, being essentially an immense amount of energy, if we want to get down to its basics, inadvertently activated something dormant in Midoriya-kun, providing the power needed to fuel the change. The chimera rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Something passed down from his parents, perhaps, though I have my doubts about that hypothesis. There's still too much we don't know. I might have a better idea when he wakes up. I thought his family was unremarkable. Toshinori said doubtfully, wondering if Nezu had found something in Izuku's background that he hadn't after all. They are, Nezu said bluntly. I've investigated back to his great-grandparents so far. I could find nothing of interest in them. That's why I'm not that confident in the idea. Still, it's the best I have at the moment. I see, Toshinori said with a sigh as he pulled up a chair, taking a seat by Izuku's bedside and looking down at the boy with worry. Nezu hopped down from his chair and began making his way to the exit. I need to get back to work. There's much to do with the entrance exam in a couple of weeks. Keep me posted on any changes, though. Then he left once both members of the faculty gave their agreement. As Chiyo turned back to her various test results, Toshinori settled in to watch over his successor, taking in the boy's slightly ragged breathing and the sweat still dotting his form, along with the pulsing of the circuits. He let out another small sigh and closed his eyes, wondering how things could have gone wrong. It was shortly after 7 p.m. when Chiyo turned to Toshinori as lunch rush arrived with her dinner. I don't believe he's going to wake up tonight, Toshinori. Go make yourself useful and inform his family. They deserve to know his condition rather than wonder if something happened to him. Toshinori hesitated, but he knew she was right. He needed to go inform Izuku's mother of what had happened, even if it meant revealing his secrets to the woman. She had a right to know why her son was hospitalized. Sighing once again, he got up, shifting into his muscle form as he did so. It was time to face the music. Midoriya Inko was growing concerned. The short, somewhat rotund woman frowned as she put the finishing touches on dinner. Izuku should have returned already. He was rarely out this late, and when he was he usually let her know, but he hadn't called or left her a message ever since he'd headed out that morning to train. She bit her lip as she wondered if something happened. She knew he was getting in shape for the UA entrance exam, and while she was proud of her son for putting so much effort into chasing his dream, most of her couldn't help but worry that he was going to get hurt, both physically and emotionally. He was definitely giving it his all, though. It was easy to see from how his physique had changed from a scrawny teen to a well-muscled young man. It was hard not to notice. She knew that if he'd stop wearing the baggy clothes he preferred, that he'd be beating girls off with a stick. Assuming said girls could get past his quirkless status, of course. Inko sighed as her mind turned back to her son's well-being. Had something happened during his training? She didn't even know where he usually went to train. Surely somebody would have called her about it, though, right? As that thought crossed her mind, a knock came at the door. Perhaps it was because of the direction her thoughts had been going, but Inko froze, feeling like a fist had taken hold of her heart and was squeezing it hard, dread filling her. Somehow she knew that getting a knock on her door instead of Izuku opening it with an apologetic look wasn't good. It was as the knock came again that she managed to shake herself out of her paralysis. Quickly making sure the food wouldn't burn, she made her way to the door and opened it, peering out curiously. Yes, her brain practically short-circuited when she saw the number 1 hero and symbol of peace in front of her apartment. All Might, she squeaked in shock, eyes wide. Hello, Midoriya-san, it's good to finally meet you. May I come in? All Might asked kindly. It was then that Inko noticed something important. All Might wasn't wearing his famous smile. That fact made her previous fears return and she sagged against the door. Something happened to Izuku, didn't it? She said, on the verge of tears. The only reason she wasn't flooding the apartment already was because she was in front of All Might. Can we discuss this inside? The greatest hero in Japan, if not the world, asked gently. Sniffling, Inko allowed the man into her home, All Might respectfully walking in and waiting for her to sit down before he began. I'm afraid something unexpected happened with young Midoriya this morning when I was training him. He began. Inko blinked, surprised out of her tears. You've been training him, she said in slight disbelief that someone as renowned as All Might would have any time for her son beyond perhaps signing an autograph. Since the sludge villain incident, yes. He impressed me immensely back then, and I decided to take him under my wing. All Might said with a smile. Why? Inko asked. Please don't misunderstand. I'm immensely proud that Izuku apparently managed to impress you enough that you'd personally train him, but there has to be more to it. All Might sighed before smiling slightly. I figured I'd have to explain everything, considering what happened to young Midoriya. It's a bit of a story, however, and I must ask that you not breathe a word of it to absolutely anybody. Not even your husband. Inko looked worried at that, but considering it was All Might asking, she could only nod her head. From there came All Might's explanation of his injury, one for all, his search for a successor, and his choice of Izuku. He'd even shifted to his true form and showed the woman the wound, much like he had to her son months before. Inko was horrified by what had been done to the man, saddened by the knowledge that soon the world would lose the symbol of peace, and a fierce, immense pride that the man had seen Izuku and decided to name him his successor in such a legacy, even though part of her now felt intense worry over her son's safety with such a burden now on his shoulders. You said something went wrong, though? Inko asked fretfully. All Might sighed as he sat back in his seat, bringing his hand up to rub his face tiredly. Young Midoriya finished the training I'd set for him a full 2 weeks ahead of schedule this morning. He began. I determined that meant he was ready to receive one for all and proceeded to pass it on. However, he had a reaction that I've never heard of any of my predecessors having and passed out, having several physical symptoms that worried me. I immediately took him to Recovery Girl at UA, since she's my personal physician and knows the secrets I just told you. Inko clenched her fists on her skirt. Is he? Recovery Girl doesn't believe his life is in danger. He assured her. That said, we're not sure what's going on, only that his body is changing. Changing how? Inko asked, relaxing slightly despite her ongoing fear at the news Izuku would live. All Might proceeded to tell her what Recovery Girl had found, finding Inko to be just as perplexed as the rest of them. And One for All didn't affect you this way? She asked once he was finished in order to clarify things. All Might shook his head. Not at all. It simply granted me the power you have seen me use before. I had no physical changes, especially not such severe ones. Inko bit her lip. Can I see him? Of course. All Might said immediately. I was waiting for you to ask. We're not going to keep you from your son, after all. He got up, shifting back into muscle form. I have a car parked outside so I can drive you to the school. Inko's quickly nodded, making her way to the kitchen. I'll be just a moment. Let me put the food I was making away. A half-hour later Inko and All Might entered UA's infirmary to find Recovery Girl performing a check on Izuku, whose status hadn't changed since All Might had left. Oh, Izuku, Inko cried, quickly making her way to her son's side. She looked up at the school nurse. How is he? Recovery Girl smiled at the younger woman reassuringly. The changes his body's going through is progressing, but as far as I can tell he isn't in any danger. I do want to ask you some questions about your family medical history, however. Inko nodded, tears falling from her eyes, and beeped Izuku's forehead. Anything to help, she said, hoping desperately that she'd be able to do so, and Izuku would wake up soon. Do you have any idea what's going on? Yan asked as he and the other previous wielders of One for All watched the weird scene occurring in front of them. Not a clue. Go grumbled. This isn't normal. It's never worked like this before. He glanced at Nana. How about you? It was your successor that passed it on. Nana's eyebrow twitched. And that means I know what's going on when One for All suddenly decides to be weird. San seemed especially annoyed. Why exactly don't we know what's going on? Aren't we part of the freaking quirk? They looked over at another of the men, the weakest looking one of them all. Do you have any idea, Ichi-sama? Ichi stared at what was happening in front of them, seeming to be in awe. All I know is, Q is truly amazing. If what I think is right, he has more potential than every previous wielder combined. What the 7 previous wielders of One for All 8, technically, as Hachi's shade was beginning to form in the quasi-mental, spiritual space they inhabited, were observing was a great orb of energy with a mass of green at the center. The green, they knew, represented the current wielder, Midoriya Izuku. What was odd was what was happening around the orb. 4 other colors had appeared, and seemed to be caught in the grip of arcs of electricity emanating from One for All. What or who those colors were, the wielders didn't know. The only information they had at the moment was the orb's names, though names didn't exactly fit, because again, quasi-mental, spiritual space. Those names were Sword, which was silver, Spider, which was blue, Sound, which was red, and Horse, which was bright yellow. What do you mean, Ichi-sama? Roku asked respectfully. Before Ichi could answer, the 4 extra orbs began to react to the energy being pumped into them by One for All. Lines like those of computer circuits began to leave Sword, each carrying what the wielders somehow knew was information in their energy. Spider began to emanate webs, as was appropriate for its name, which stuck to the walls, which began to shift. Sound began to vibrate, emanating a beautiful noise that none of the wielders would be able to adequately describe beyond melodic and soothing. And Horse began to bounce around, a blast of energy emanating from it each time it stopped, which dissipated to shower the surroundings with light. The wielders watched this with awe, somehow knowing what they were seeing was something momentous. Ichi simply smiled, feeling reassured that the work he had entrusted to his successors would now be completed far beyond what he'd hoped for. As the 4 orbs were drawn into One for All, touching the green of the current successor, streaking it lightly with their colors, becoming part of it while still apart so as not to overwhelm, Ichi's smile widened, feeling content as he knew that the work he'd set out for himself and his successors was in good hands. What I mean, Roku, is that, seeing those 4 entities join Q in a way even we never could, and knowing we will all support him, we are witnessing the birth of not just a symbol, but a legend. Izuku groaned as his eyes slowly began to open. He felt tired, and his body ached like he was getting over the flu. Once his eyes managed to focus, he glanced around at his surroundings, only partly surprised to find himself in what appeared to be an infirmary. His gaze focused on his mother, who sat at his bedside, apparently fast asleep. He felt a twinge of guilt when he saw the lines of stress on her face, knowing that he'd caused them. His attention turned to the door when All Might walked in carrying a tray with some tea on it. The fact that the man was in his true, skinny form around his mother threw Izuku's mind for a loop, but when he opened his mouth to ask, all that escaped was a rasp as the teen realized how dry his throat was. All Might's eyes widened when he saw Izuku was awake, almost dropping the tray. Young Midoriya, he cried out in surprise, making Inko jerk awake, eyes blinking tiredly, and drawing an elderly woman that Izuku recognized as Recovery Girl from another part of the infirmary. Izuku, Inko cried, hugging him tightly as she cried enough tears to fill a fish tank. All Might set the drinks he'd brought down on a nearby table and approached with a smile on his face. How are you doing, young man? Izuku coughed. Water. A few minutes later Izuku was sitting up in bed, sipping on some water as Recovery Girl poked and prodded him. You really gave your mother and mentor a fright, young man. The elderly hero said as she checked his temperature. Sorry. he said as he glanced from his mother, who had calmed down and was sitting on her chair, watching him, to All Might, who was still skinny. I told her everything, All Might said. Considering how long you've been unconscious, she deserved to know. Izuku ducked his head slightly as he looked at his mother. I'm sorry for not telling you, Mom. Inko waved the apology off. I'm not exactly thrilled that you didn't, but I understand your reasons. She sighed before smiling. I'm just glad you're okay. Izuku smiled back before something All Might had said registered. Wait, how long have I been out? He began to panic. I didn't miss the entrance exam, did I? All Might raised his hands reassuringly. Not at all, young Midoriya. You've been asleep for a week. You have plenty of time. Izuku slumped with relief. Good. Then he blinked. Wait, a week? I've been out a week. Scariest week of my life. Inko said, slumping slightly as she finally relaxed after a week of worrying. The changes your body went through only ended this morning. Recovery Girl told him as she took his blood pressure. So it's not too surprising that you only just woke up. Before anything else could be said, Izuku's attention was drawn back to the door, which opened to allow the principal of UA through the door. Izuku immediately went rigid. PP Principal Nezu, sir. Indeed, Nezu said as he approached the bed, deciding to forego his usual introduction as he quickly hopped up onto one of the seats. It's good to see that you've awoken, Midoriya-kun. Thank you, sir. Izuku said, trying not to get on the Chimera's bad side. Nezu appeared to be amused by Izuku's nervousness, but didn't comment on it. Instead he sat down and fixed his gaze on the team. Have you been informed of what happened? I lost consciousness after receiving one for all as my body went through some changes. Izuku said, I'm not surprised, seeing as the changes weren't just physical. Everyone focused on him more than they already had at that. What do you mean? Inko asked worriedly. Izuku took a deep breath, knowing that his next words were going to sound unbelievable. My body had to adjust to make use of the abilities of the past lives of mine that became active when I received one for all. Absolute silence reigned in the infirmary for a long moment. Eventually, as Izuku began to fidget, All Might gave a bloody cough. What? Izuku laughed a bit nervously. Funny thing, apparently reincarnation is a real thing, and I've received the memories and abilities of 4 of my past lives. There was stunned blinking all around as those present tried to process his words. Finally Nezu seemed to recover first. Anybody we might know? Izuku immediately shook his head. No sir. Souls are rarely bound to a single strand of the multiverse. My past selves are from different realities. I know that because I have all their memories, and quirks the way we know them here just weren't a thing to them. Another moment of shock, but this time it was Inko who spoke worriedly. You have the memories of 4 other people. Izuku nodded before smiling reassuringly. Don't worry, Mom. I'm still Midoriya Izuku first and foremost. I remember my past lives, and even the emotions of those memories, but they're removed enough that they haven't completely changed me. You might see a few new habits and preferences shine through, but I'm still your son. Inko relaxed at his words, giving him a thankful smile for his reassurance. She'd been worried that the son she loved so much had been turned into a completely different person, and apparently he'd realized that. Still, she knew she'd been paying close attention to his behavior in the future. Forgive me, young Midoriya, but this seems rather unbelievable. All Might said slowly. Izuku chuckled lightly. Tell me about it. But it's the truth. He sighed before looking down at his hands. I remember things, All Might. I remember fighting monsters you wouldn't believe, learning skills even most quirks wouldn't be able to replicate, and enduring things that had to be real. He took a deep breath as the adults all looked at him silently, letting him continue. I remember losing my brother and spending years desperately searching for him. I remember fighting a mad king to the death to keep an existential threat from wiping out a city, if not more. I remember killing a demigod for a woman I wasn't sure I loved. He grit his teeth. I remember the agony of my wife miscarrying our daughter due to a villain's personal attack. He heard Inko gasp in horror when she heard that. Then he looked up to look All Might in the eye. It doesn't matter if you believe me, All Might, because nothing can erase those memories. I am still Midoriya Izuku. But now, I'm also much, much more than that. All Might stared at Izuku for a long moment before nodding, knowing Izuku was entirely correct. Nezu gave Izuku a moment to recover himself before speaking. Would you mind telling us about your past selves, Midoriya-kun? Maybe also what abilities you believe you gained from them. Izuku nodded with a small smile on his face. Sure, I'll start with the one you'll be able to comprehend the most. A New Yorker called Peter Parker, who went by the hero name Spider-Man. Ah, so you were a pro-hero in that life? Nezu asked with interest. Izuku shook his head. Not really. Pro-heroes weren't a profession in that world, at least during my era. I was actually a vigilante, though one the government tacitly approved of. I didn't get paid for my heroics, which caused a lot of issues during my life, seeing as I was evicted more than once due to not being able to keep a steady job. All Might frowned. Unfortunate. The current system has its flaws, but it at least allows heroes to make a living protecting people. Izuku snorted lightly in amusement. You have no idea how much I would have appreciated a system like the one this world uses. Sure, I had other heroic friends who were willing to spot me some money every once in a while, but it would have been nice if the Avengers paid a salary for membership or something like that. The Avengers? Inko asked with a light frown, not sure she liked the name. One of the superhero teams I was a member of, and probably the most prominent one in that world. Izuku explained. We had a pretty large roster. I was generally more of a street-level hero, but I was ready to join in when it came to more global threats, like the occasional alien invasion. At that all the adults blinked multiple times. Aliens were a thing on that world. All Might asked incredulously. Oh sure, Izuku said with a nod and a smile. More than a few that liked to cause trouble, like the Kree and the Skrulls. Plus all the other global threats, like various warlords or supervillains. And you said quirks weren't a thing there? Nezu prompted. Izuku pursed his lips. Not in the same way, no. For example, I got my powers when a spider that had undergone severe mutation due to radiation exposure bit me. There were others that had powers and abilities from different sources, like the various magic users, or people without any powers at all but that made up for it with extreme training and skill or by using technology. Nobody with inborn powers, then? Nezu asked, his academic curiosity asking to be sated. There were. They were known by the derogatory name of mutants, since their powers came from a mutation in a set of DNA colloquially known as an X gene. They are a lot like quirks, but have been around since at least ancient Egypt, though the population had grown a lot during my time. Izuku sighed. Unfortunately they were the victims of a lot of racism and bigotry, being hunted down and killed or put in concentration camps in some cases. Inko had a hand to her mouth. That's horrible. Izuku nodded. I was friends with a group of mutant heroes known as the X-Men, whose main focus was to protect the world and show humanity that mutants didn't need to be feared. Of course, they ended up fighting against both human and mutant supremacists a lot. I will definitely be asking you for more details on that world, as it sounds fascinating, but let's talk about you. Nezu said brightly. What were your powers? Considering how I got my powers, they were obviously spider-based. Izuku said with a smile before getting out of bed in spite of Recovery Girl's tutting and his mother's worried look. Making his way to a relatively empty wall, he placed his hands on it before beginning to crawl along it, his body bending in ways a baseline humans shouldn't be able to. Izuku smiled down at them all from the ceiling before letting go once his demonstration was over, flipping easily to land in a low crouch, hands and feet on the floor, before getting back up. Interesting. Is that all you can do? Or is there more? Nezu asked as he started making notes on his phone. Izuku nodded and began to speak. Increased strength, enough to lift and move multiple tons, though with one for all backing me up that limit is probably a lot higher. Superhuman agility, flexibility, speed, stamina, reflexes and durability. A moderate healing factor and heightened immune system. And probably my most important one and the one that saved my life more times than I can count, my spider sense. Nezu looked up from where he was rapidly typing, the others in the room allowing the hyper-intelligent animal to lead the questioning. Spider sense. A light precognitive ability that warns me of danger. Izuku said. I instinctively know where danger is coming from up to a few seconds in advance, and my body normally moves automatically to avoid it. It generally encompasses pretty much anything I consider harmful, though it doesn't trigger when it comes to those I trust. All Might looked impressed. That last ability alone is hero tier, he said with a smile. Added to all the rest, I imagine you were a very effective hero. Izuku shrugged. I did all right, he said modestly as he made his way back to his bed under Recovery Girl's disapproving gaze. Nezu finished typing before turning his attention back to Izuku. What about another of your lives? Izuku considered which one to tell them next before nodding to himself. Next I'll tell you about my life as Saotome Ranma, living in the Nerima district of Tokyo. There were no superpowered individuals in that world, not like here or my Spider-Man world. Magic was a thing, though, and it caused me personally no end of trouble, though most of my problems were caused by my father. Inko tilted her head to the side. How so? I was a martial artist in that life. Likely the best in my generation, if I'm being honest. Izuku said with a small, proud smile. I was trained since I was 2 years old, when my father took me away from home on a training trip that lasted almost a decade and a half. Looking back on myself from my current viewpoint, I had a lot of issues due to not being raised around people normally or going to school on a consistent basis. He said, frowning slightly at the memories he could now look at through a new lens. So your father took you on a training trip that most likely left you socially and intellectually stunted. Nezu said with an understanding nod. Yes, that would cause many issues. Izuku snorted derisively. Oh, that wasn't the main problem, though it definitely didn't help. No, the old panda engaged me to dozens of girls on the training trip, usually out of greed or gluttony. One time when I was about 3 he engaged me to a girl in exchange for a fish, a bowl of rice, and a few pickles. He said with a dark look. All of the adults in the room stared at Izuku incredulously. You're joking, Recovery Girl said, shock in her voice. Izuku shook his head with a sigh. No, you have no idea how much trouble I had dealing with crazy fiancés and rival suitors. He hung his head at the memories of the sheer amount of insanity he'd endured during that lifetime. The adults glanced at each other before Nezu coughed politely to get Izuku's attention. Let's focus on something other than that for now, then. What abilities have you gained from that life? You said you were a martial artist. Which style? My main style was the family's anything goes martial arts, which was essentially an amalgamation of multiple styles into a single, cohesive whole. Part of the style's philosophy is to take the strengths of other styles into your own, so I know quite a bit of a lot of different styles. Izuku crossed his arms and tilted his head to the side. Honestly, my life as Ranma is going to help a lot when it comes to the abilities from all my past lives. I've already mostly figured out how to meld all the different skills and abilities from my various selves into a single style, so I won't suddenly freeze in indecision over how to react to a threat. Sounds very useful, Nezu said in agreement as he noted that down. Anything else? Quote. You ever read one of those old martial arts manga from before Quirks? Izuku asked with a smile. The ones where the martial artists can use their internal energy to do absurd things a quirkless human shouldn't be able to. Seeing that they were getting where he was going with the questions, Izuku held up a hand, furrowing his brow before slowly a small orb of golden energy appeared above his palm, shining brightly. After a few moments he let it dissipate, taking a breath and wiping his forehead. Phew, that was harder than it should have been. I don't think that emotion is going to work for me like it did when I was Ranma. Emotion? All Might asked. Drawing ki out like that requires an emotional component. Izuku explained. The person I adapted it from used depression. As Ranma, I used confidence. But I'm too different from how I was as Ranma for that to work as easily for me, so I'll need to find something that works better for my current self. Interesting, Nezu murmured as he wrote that down. Can anybody learn to do that? Izuku thought about it. Technically everybody has the potential to do so. It requires an absurd amount of dedication and training, though. Even most grandmasters wouldn't be able to do what I just did. Pity. If it could be taught, then it would help less combat-oriented heroes significantly. The Chimera said with a sigh. Then he perked up again. All right, How about your next life? Izuku scratched his chin before shrugging. My life as Jesse Faden was interesting. During that life I was the director of the Federal Bureau of Control in the United States. All Might raised an eyebrow. I don't believe I've heard of such an agency, he said slowly, not liking the implications of the name. If they exist in this world, you wouldn't have. Izuku said seriously. They are an agency focused on dealing and containing what they call paranatural phenomena. It's another completely quirkless world, so they focused on things like objects that can move on their own, or launch blasts of energy, or levitate. Basically, things outside of the bounds of nature as science understood them. The Bureau would hunt down such objects or people, contain them, especially if they were dangerous, and then study them to better understand them, all while hiding the truth from the general public. Nezu raised an eyebrow. Sounds like something out of some sort of horror or science fiction story, he said, prompting an amused smile from Izuku. You have no idea. Running that place was insane, especially considering when I first arrived there at 28 I ended up in the middle of an invasion by a hostile force from another dimension that the former director was manipulated into letting free. He shook his head. Honestly, none of my past selves knew what a normal life was, till the day I died as Jesse. Hearing people call me Madam Director just felt weird. Inko had been trying to keep up with the insane things her son was matter-of-factly speaking about, but one thing he'd just said stuck out to her. Wait, Madam Director, she asked in shock. Izuku scratched the back of his head. Ah, yes, souls aren't bound by gender. Jesse Faden was born and died a woman. He shook his head again, face a bit red. Honestly, I now know more about women than I ever wanted to. All Might looked at his successor a bit askance as Nezu let out some squeaky laughter. Well, I imagine that will at least come in handy when you enter the dating scene, the principal said between laughs. Inko looked like she was trying to wrap her head around the idea that her son now had the memories of being a woman, with all that likely entailed. To distract herself she asked him another question. So, did you get any abilities from that life, honey? Izuku crossed his arms in thought. You know, I'm not sure. All the powers I had during that time came from being bound to certain objects of power at the Bureau. Those connections should have been severed when I died. But, he looked around before spotting a small table set to the side where Recovery Girl had set the handgun that had appeared while Izuku was unconscious. His eyebrows rose when he saw the gun. Well, that's here, so maybe. He lifted his hand, and suddenly the table flew towards him, stopping a foot or so away from his hand, floating easily. Then he let it drop back onto the floor with a clatter and picked up the gun. Looks like I still have my abilities after all, along with the service weapon. Service weapon? Nezu asked, once again taking notes. It's an object of power that binds itself only to the director of the FBC. If anybody else tries to use it, it kills them, Izuku said seriously, making everybody start eyeing the gun a bit more warily. It's basically the director's symbol of office. I became director when I picked it up and used it without dying after the last director, Trench, committed suicide with it. It's very powerful. He looked down at it, frowning. I'm surprised it's here though. It should be with whoever became director after me. He tilted his head slightly. A copy, maybe. Possibly, Recovery Girl said with a nod. It appeared in your hand during your first day here. Maybe it was created by your power. Izuku hummed before turning back to Nezu. My other abilities mostly involve telekinesis in some form or another, letting me pull and launch objects, levitate for short periods, dash around, and form a shield out of debris. He deliberately didn't say anything about his mind control abilities. Nezu nodded gratefully at the information, noting it all down. Thank you, Midoriya-kun. Then he looked back up. And as for your final life, that one was pretty insane as well, Izuku said with a light chuckle. My name was Emiyashiro, and I lived in Fuyuki, here in Japan, during some of the most important events of my life. He ran his fingers through his hair. I've mentioned in previous worlds that magic existed, right? As the others nodded he continued. I was a magus when I was Shuru, if a third-rate one. When I was 17 I ended up embroiled in something called the Holy Grail War. The heroes glanced at each other with frowns on their faces, not pleased by the sound of that, while Inko stared at Izuku, not liking the idea of anybody that age becoming entangled in anything that could be called a war. What did this Holy Grail war entail, Midoriya-kun? Nezu asked seriously. It sounds as though it has some sort of religious significance. It doesn't, Izuku said bluntly, and they could all hear the distaste in his voice. Nothing about that damn thing was holy. At their looks he sighed. The Holy Grail was a nearly omnipotent wish-granting device holding immense power. The person who possessed it could bring nearly any desire to life, from true resurrection to the destruction of the planet itself. Eyes around the room widened. That's not good. Recovery Girl said. You have no idea, Izuku said with another tired sigh. The Holy Grail War was a battle royale between 7 masters and their servants, being summoned through a ritual that were more powerful than any human could be. He looked at All Might. Most pro-heroes would stand no chance against a servant. Even you would fall to some of the upper echelons in their ranks. All Might's eyes rose at that. It wasn't arrogance to say he was probably in the top 5 strongest beings on the planet, even as weakened as he was, so that was quite a statement. What is a servant then, young Midoriya? Izuku pursed his lips in order to think of how best to explain it. Outside of space and time, at the root of reality, exists a thing called the Throne of Heroes. People whose deeds have transcended humanity and reach into legend are removed from the cycle of reincarnation and reside there. These are known as heroic spirits. He paused to let Nezu finish writing his notes before continuing. People like Heracles, Miyamoto Musashi and Jeanne d'Arc are enshrined in the Throne of Heroes. Through a ritual during the Holy Grail War, these spirits can be summoned as servants, and like I said, they're more powerful than pretty much any human could be, at least in the modern era. That's partly because they draw power from their legend. The more well-known a servant's legend is, the more power they have alongside what they already did. But even low-tier heroic spirits could slaughter a large number of heroes. And I assume you ended up master of one of these servants? Nezu asked. Izuku nodded. I was a master through no choice of my own. My servant was King Arthur. He smiled softly at the memory before continuing. During the war one was mainly trying to survive and keep the collateral damage down, especially since I was orphaned in the previous war. He sighed before shaking his head in disgust. I'll save you the gory details for now, but in the end it turned out that the Holy Grail had been infected by a malicious entity calling itself Angra Mainyu during one of the previous wars. Nezu quickly did a search for the name Izuku had just given him, and if his fur wasn't already white he would have paled. According to this, Angra Mainyu is the name of the god of evil in the Zoroastrian religion. Izuku nodded. Yes, my adoptive father was the winner of the Grail War before mine, and he claimed the Grail to wish for world peace. A noble goal, All Might admitted. Yeah, though I don't agree with his methods. He was not nice when it came to his enemies. Izuku sighed. But when he claimed the Grail he found Angra Mainyu in it, who agreed to grant his wishes winner, by killing every person in the world besides him, his wife and his daughter. Eyes went wide at that, with Inko bringing a hand to her mouth in horror. He refused, of course. All Might said. He did, and he forced his servant to destroy the Grail. The backlash destroyed a large portion of the city and started a literally cursed fire that claimed thousands, including my previous family, and almost killed me. Izuku paused, looking briefly haunted by the memories, before he continued. In any case, events during my Grail War ended up nearly releasing Angra Mainyu. With all the power the Grail had accumulated during multiple wars backing it, it would have been a literal end of the world scenario. So me and a few others went to stop him. I had to fight Gilgamesh, the king of heroes, in order to be able to get to Angra Mainyu in time to destroy it. I imagine that wasn't an easy battle, even with someone like King Arthur at your side. Nezu said sympathetically. Izuku smiled wryly. Saber had gone on to face Angra Mainyu while I fought Gilgamesh, actually. Eyes widened again. I thought you said even pro-heroes couldn't face a servant. They couldn't, Izuku said bluntly. And Gilgamesh is probably among the top 10 heroic spirits. He could slaughter every hero in Japan, All Might included, on his own if he took things seriously. But he didn't. He underestimated me, and by the time he got over his arrogance in order to kill me, I'd already killed him. How? Inko asked, enthralled. Izuku held out his hands and focused for a moment. Then, out of nowhere, two beautiful swords were in his hands, one white, one black. I have a skill unique to me I call tracing. At a glance I can know everything about any weapon, especially bladed ones, and then by spending some energy I can create an almost perfect copy. This includes even legendary weapons with magical abilities, like Caliburn or Guy Bolg, and I can use those abilities myself. I can also wield the weapons with only a bit less skill than the original users, because I know their styles as well as they do. A fact the skills I gained as Ranma are making good use of. Once again, the hero's eyebrows went up. That's a potent skill, All Might said admiringly, and you can use that skill now, as your current self. Izuku nodded as he let the swords fade away. Yeah, so my arsenal will only grow. He felt no need to tell them about unlimited blade works, especially as he doubted it would work for him anymore beyond being where his weapons resided. He wasn't Emiyashuru anymore. Not entirely. Nezu finished up his notes before putting his phone away. This has all been fascinating, Midoriya-kun, and I hope to continue discussing things further with you, whether or not you join our fine institution. He hopped off the chair. However, I think you should go home with your mother and rest, assuming Recovery Girl releases you. The entrance exam is in a week, after all, and in spite of any instinctive knowledge you might have regarding your new abilities, you still need to prepare and make sure you can use them properly. Izuku nodded with a smile. Thank you, Principal, I won't disappoint. I'm sure you won't, Nezu said with a smile before leaving the room with a last bow to both of them. All Might let out a sigh as Recovery Girl resumed checking Izuku over. You scared the crap out of me, young man. Me too, Inko said, resting a hand on her son's arm, teary-eyed once again from the relief that he was all right. Izuku smiled apologetically to the both of them. I'm sorry, Mom, All Might. To be fair, I didn't exactly do it on purpose. And now I'm even better prepared for joining UA than I was before. All Might chuckled. Just from what you've told us about what you now remember, along with your new skills, I'd say you're pretty much ready to go pro as is. He sat back as he watched his successor get poked and prodded. Honestly, your potential is ridiculous, even without factoring in One for All. I have no doubt you'll end up surpassing me easily. Izuku smiled. Thanks, All Might. He perked up. I don't suppose you'd mind sparring with me for the next few days. Make sure I've managed to incorporate all my skills correctly. All Might buffed up and let out a laugh. It would be my pleasure to assess your skills, young Midoriya. Recovery Girl tutted. Not even out of the infirmary and already rushing to come back, she sat back and looked at Izuku seriously. As far as I can tell, your alterations haven't caused you any harm, but I still want you to take it easy at least tomorrow to make sure there aren't any complications. You can train with All Might after that, though I expect you to come here immediately if you notice anything wrong. Despite her size and appearance, the elderly healer took on a distinctly ominous air. Am I understood? Izuku and All Might nodded frantically. Good, she said calmly after that. Then you're free to leave, young man. Good luck on the entrance exam. Izuku got out of bed, pulling on the shirt that had been set aside for him and slipping the service weapon into his pocket. Thank you, Recovery Girl. Inko got up and bowed deeply to the elder woman as well. Yes, thank you so much for your help. I'm very grateful. Recovery Girl waved the thanks away. Just doing my job. Still, she had a pleased smile on her face. The three left UA shortly thereafter with All Might driving them to their apartment. As the evening sky darkened and the buildings slid past, Izuku looked out the window, lost in the myriad memories now occupying his head, and focusing on certain particular ones. Ones that he hadn't told the others about. Memories of his past selves agreeing to be activated in a future life, knowing that they would be needed to combat some great threat. What that threat was, Izuku didn't know. But something told him that he'd be finding out sooner rather than later. Izuku sighed as he prepared himself to head out to the UA entrance exam. In spite of all the changes he'd gone through in the past couple of weeks, a part of him couldn't help but be nervous about what was to come, even though he knew intellectually that he was likely better prepared than any of the other applicants. He'd spent 4 days sparring with All Might, getting his body used to using his full abilities and testing out his new fighting style, working the bugs out as best he could. At first, in spite of his enhancements, Izuku lost more often than not. Not only did he need to work out the kinks in how he fought, none of his previous lives had ever had super strength on the level that both he and All Might now had, so he had very little clue on how to use it. All Might fight more as a brawler than with any real fighting style, at least as far as his Ranma side was concerned, but there got to be a point where overwhelming power simply trumped skill. However, as the days went on and Izuku got used to using all his new abilities together, the odds started to turn, and now he could win at least half the time. All Might still had several tricks up his sleeves, and he could be surprisingly imaginative in how he applied his strength, so the Greenette was occasionally blindsided, but he now had his own tricks and greater skill to fall back on. And they both knew that the more Izuku fought and gained experience, the quicker he'd begin to surpass All Might. Of course, who would win a true, all-out, life-or-death battle was currently up in the air. Neither was interested in fighting with the intent to kill in order to find out. Though All Might, at least, knew that Izuku was the more likely to win such a clash, and Izuku couldn't help but reluctantly agree, much as the part of him that was still an All Might fanboy called foul. He hadn't just focused on his physical skills, however. He'd done some quick cramming over what he likely needed to know for the written test, his now enhanced intelligence making short work of the information, giving him a bit of confidence that he'd do well on the written portion of the exam. Slipping his jacket over his shoulders and making sure the service weapon was hidden in the special holster All Might had obtained for him, though he made sure he also had the permit for it Nezu had set up for him. In case a copper hero noticed and tried to make an issue of it, Izuku left his room to find his mother finishing putting away the breakfast leftovers. She looked over at him and smiled. "Are you ready, Izuku?" Izuku nodded firmly, getting his nerves mostly under control. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inko approached her son and pulled him into a hug, which he happily returned. "Before everything that happened, I would have been more than proud of you for simply trying to pass the exam. Now I know you will pass with flying colors, and show everybody why All Might chose you." She pulled back and took his face in her hands, smiling slightly wetly. "I'm so proud of you, Izuku. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the support you needed all these years, but I want you to know that I always have been." Izuku smiled back, a tear in his eye, before he simply hugged her again, letting that do the speaking for him. Then he pulled back and went to put on his shoes. Taking a deep breath, he gave his mother one last smile. "I promise I'm going to ace this." With that he left as she waved goodbye. Not long afterwards Izuku entered the UA campus for the first time under his own power. He paused to look up at the imposing main building of the school, a small smile on his face. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself to step forward and begin his journey to heroism in this life. Unfortunately, a very familiar voice interrupted him. "Get out of my way, Deku." Bakugo Katsuki's voice barked behind him, angry irritation in the dulcet tones. "Kachan?" Izuku asked out of habit as he turned to find the blonde he hadn't seen since his changes striding toward him. Said explosive youth's shoulder checked him with an angry grunt. The Peter side of Izuku dearly wanted to make some sort of comment, but he clamped the urge down. He knew that saying something would set the blonde off, and he figured getting into a fight before even entering the building for the exam wouldn't help his chances at getting accepted. Instead, he just gave an irritated sigh as he watched Bakugo walk away. One of these days he's gonna mouth off to someone who isn't going to take his shit and get wrecked. He muttered in irritation. "Yeah, he seems kind of unpleasant," a girl's voice said behind Izuku. The Greenette blinked before turning to find a cute brunette with bobbed hair and round brown eyes, a permanent blush on her cheeks. "Well, you shouldn't let him get you down and just focus on passing," she said with a smile. Izuku smiled, already liking this girl's attitude. "Agreed." He began to walk, the girl falling into step. "Nervous?" "A bit," she admitted as they walked. "This is going to be such a huge challenge. I can't imagine not being nervous." Izuku chuckled. "True, but just think about how good it will feel once you surpass it," he said as they entered the building and followed the signs to where they needed to go. "My name's Midoriya Izuku, by the way." "Ah, nice to meet you, Midoriya-kun." she said peppily. I'm Uraraka Ochako. They reached the rooms for the written test, which had people assigning seats according to the IDs they'd been granted. Well, good luck with the exam, Uraraka-san. Maybe we'll run into each other later. I hope so, Uraraka said as she waved to him and headed to one of the attendants. Good luck. You too. Feeling more relaxed now that he'd had a pleasant moment with a pretty girl, and ignoring his Ranma side's deep distrust of any such interactions, Izuku headed for his own testing room with a smile on his face. Almost 2 hours later, Izuku was walking to the auditorium where the orientation for the practical portion of the exam was going to be held. The written test had been grueling, showing that UA was not kidding around when it came to weeding people out of the running, but thankfully he felt pretty sure he'd aced it. Feeling confident, he walked into the large room and looked for a seat. He spotted Uraraka some distance from him and waved to her, receiving a wave back. His good mood evaporated, however, when he found himself at his seat, finding Bakugo already in the one next to it. Oh joy, he muttered to himself as he sat down, doing his best to ignore the explosive teen, who seemed to be content to do the same. The lights came on to highlight the podium, showing the pro hero and teacher present mic at the front. Welcome to today's live performance. Everybody say, hey, he exclaimed loudly, as exuberant as he always was when Izuku listened to his radio show. Unfortunately for him, everybody was too nervous to respond, and silence enveloped the room. Had he been his old self, Izuku would be muttering up a storm of hero facts regarding present mic, but he managed to clamp down on the urge now due to the seriousness of the situation, focusing intently to make sure he got everything. He didn't notice Bakugo glance at him at the uncharacteristic silence, a bit confused if relieved that he didn't have to listen to that. From there, present mic explained the way the practical test would go, all while trying to hype up the nervous teens and get a reaction out of them. Excuse me, may I ask a question? A boy said with his hand up once present mic had explained the different types of foe villains they'd be facing. When the hero pointed to him with a grin, the boy was revealed to be tall and well-built, with black hair and glasses. There appeared to be no fewer than 4 varieties of foe villain on this handout. He said loudly as he held up the handout they'd all been given. Such a blatant error, if it is one, is highly unbecoming for Japan's top academy. We're all here today in the hopes of being molded into model heroes. Izuku felt an eyebrow raise. This kid was far too serious for his own good. He supposed he could put it down to nerves, but something told him the guy was always like that. Thank you for calling in, examinee 7111. Nice catch, present mic said airily, but the 4th foe villain variety is not meant to be fought, but avoided. Attacking one could make you lose all the points you've accumulated till that moment, so you need to keep away, because it'll go after the largest group of people it can locate. There were murmurs at that, but the boy who'd brought it up simply bowed 90 degrees before sitting back down. Looking around to see if there were any more questions, present mic smiled. All right then, listeners, that's all from me. I'll leave you with our school motto. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, a hero is one who surpasses life's tribulations. Plus ultra. A short bus ride later and Izuku stood with a large number of fellow examinees in front of the gates to a large mock city. He shook his head in amused amazement when he saw it and heard someone mention that UA had several on campus. The school had to have more money than Tony Stark in order to support its absurd campus. He could only imagine how much they hit up alumni for donations. Glancing around at his competition, he smiled when he spotted Uraraka nearby, taking deep breaths and appearing to try to calm herself. He approached her with a smile, slipping among the various teams with ease till he reached her, tapping her on the shoulder. She jumped slightly, startled, but smiled when she turned and saw him. Ah, Midoriya-kun, so you're here too. She gave herself a small shake. I'm kind of nervous. I think I did well in the written exam, but this'll be something very different. Relax, he said soothingly. You'll do fine. Uraraka let out a small breath before relaxing a bit. Thanks, Midoriya-kun. She looked him over, taking in the tight, green, sleeveless Chinese shirt, which gave an excellent view of his muscular body, a fact that made her blush when she noticed it. His legs were covered by black kung fu pants that looked made to allow for increased range of movement, and very thin slip-on shoes. Contrasting sharply with the rest of his look, however, was a holster at his side which held a blocky black handgun. "You look prepared." Izuku smiled, but before he could respond he heard Present Mike's voice call out for them to start. As Uraraka and the rest of the examinees blinked in confusion at the abrupt announcement, Izuku launched himself over the heads of the teens that stood between him and the now open doors before beginning to dash forward at high speed. He'd barely entered the mock city when a one-pointer robot approached him. As the examinus watched, he drew his pistol with a smooth movement and fired without slowing his pace in the slightest, the shot turning the robot's head into so much scrap and making it drop into a heap. Before long he was out of sight of the rest of the examinees. "Well, what are you waiting for? He's got the right idea. There are no countdowns in real life. Move it," Mike shouted. Uraraka immediately set her face in a mask of determination and began to run, several other teens shaking off the surprise and joining her. Izuku rushed through the mock city without stopping for a moment, destroying every enemy in his path. Punching the head off a two-pointer, he used his telekinesis to launch it into a three-pointer with enough force to blow a huge hole into it before bringing his gun up to shoot the head off another one-pointer, completely focused on his task. That didn't mean he ignored his fellow examinees. Whenever he came across one that was being overwhelmed or simply in a disadvantageous situation, he'd pause long enough to even the odds, sometimes even fighting alongside them for a bit, letting them get some kills in. All in all, it actually reminded Izuku of certain times in Peter's life where he'd had to fight in large-scale urban battles alongside other heroes, the familiarity helping him perform that much better. He smiled as he left the pretty though expressionless girl he'd been helping as she shrunk the robots before stomping on them, pleased with the progress he was making. He estimated he already had 70 points, and there were still several minutes left in the test. If things continued on the way they'd been going, he'd pass with no problem. In the room the teachers were using to monitor the examinees, Midnight tapped a finger to her lips, humming thoughtfully. "We've got a good crop this year," she said with a pleased smile. Smentos nodded from where he sat beside her. "Indeed, we have several examinees that show excellent proficiency in the traits we look for in our students. That one, however, is definitely making a splash," Midnight continued as she pointed at a screen showing Izuku running along a wall to reach a boy launching lasers from his stomach, who was being overwhelmed. "Good situational awareness, excellent ability to move and use terrain, no hesitation or difficulty coming up with plans, great use of his abilities." Izuku launched himself from above, slamming an axe kick into a one-pointer that turned it into junk. "And absurd combat abilities. I can already tell he's going to be big, with or without our help," she said with a saucy smirk. "Indeed," Ectoplasm said. "There's a boy in another test site who has racked up an impressive score without getting a single rescue point, but if we're looking for someone that exemplifies everything we're looking for." Nezu and Toshinori glanced at each other, pleased that Izuku was being looked at so favorably. "Indeed, but the test isn't over," the Chimera said, nodding to Toshinori, who proceeded to flip a glass cover off the Yuruki switch and press the button. "It's time to see what he, and the rest of this year's applicants, are truly made of." Izuku paused to catch his breath, pleased with his progress. He estimated he had almost 90 points now, so he figured he could afford to take a small break. Looking around he saw that he'd ended up near where the bulk of the applicants were fighting, a large group of examinees taking out robots in a wide street. He was pleased to see that a few of them were watching each other's backs, though he couldn't tell if it was just opportunism or an actual desire to help. He was about to start hunting once again, wanting to see if he could break the 100-point mark in the minute or two left in the test when the ground began to shake. Looking over at the direction the rumbling was coming from, his eyes widened when he saw an enormous multi-story robot making its way towards the area the examinees were gathered in, destroying the buildings in its way as it passed. Quickly deducing that this was the fourth type of foe villain, the one that would make you lose all your points if you fought it, the student hopeful scrambled to run away, not willing to tangle with such a powerful enemy even without the threat of point loss to make it more daunting. Seeing that his fellow examinees were doing the smart thing, Izuku prepared to do the same as the boy who'd asked the question during the orientation ran past him. However, as he turned to leave, his ears caught the almost inaudible sound of a girl in pain. Izuku whirled around to find Uraraka on the ground in front of the approaching robot, her legs pinned beneath a pile of debris that had fallen due to the thing's rampage that were keeping her from moving. She looked frightened even as she tried to reach for the debris to get it off. Izuku didn't think, simply beginning to run. As he did, his mind went through plans at lightspeed. He couldn't telekinetically pull Uraraka from under the rubble because he could cause serious damage when she was wrenched out of it. There were too many different pieces of debris to pull them all off with it without hurting her in time. He hadn't built his web shooters yet, and he could trace the shooters themselves in time, but not the complex chemicals of the fluid itself, not without more practice, which he berated himself for not doing before. In the teacher's monitoring room, Nezu discreetly pulled out his phone and pulled up a command screen that read, "Remove. C. Yuruki's safety restrictions. Yes, no," and quickly tapped, "Yes" with a small smirk. Izuku's eyes widened as he saw the gigantic robot pull a fist back, ready to punch down at Uraraka and turn her into paste. With gritted teeth he flooded one for all through his entire body and launched himself towards her. Said girl stared up in terror as the fist began to rocket down toward her, ready to end her life. Her life flashed before her eyes, and she began to tear up as she realized that she was going to leave her parents alone. In her heart, she pleaded for someone to save her. The students that had run away stared in shock as the massive metal fist slammed into the ground, blowing a shockwave of dust that obscured their vision, all of them sure they'd just seen a girl die, only to gasp at what they saw when the dust cleared. Ochako had closed her eyes at the point the fist was feet away from her, sure she'd never see anything else again. When she didn't feel any pain, she opened her eyes, which quickly widened in awe. Izuku stood over her, glaring upwards, the robot's fist straining against his outstretched hand, having caught and stopped it before it could hit Ochako, arcs of green energy sparking along his body. Then his free hand glowed gold, and before any of the spectators could make out what was going on, he'd swung his arm upwards, the robotic limb severing at the elbow joint. Then whatever he'd been holding disappeared before most could make it out. Ochako had seen it, however, her mouth open in awe at the sword she'd just seen Izuku wield. Calling the weapon beautiful would have been a disservice, because it defied such conventional descriptors. Just that brief glance filled the girl with hope, like she was in the presence of something that would deny the world's end and rise triumphant. As the robot reared back, as though confused by the loss of its arm, said limb began to float a foot or so above Izuku's hand, obviously under his control now. It twisted around till the still clenched fist was aimed at the robot's head, before rocketing forward as though shot out of a railgun, obliterating its target. Izuku wasn't satisfied, however, as even before he'd finished firing the arm he had leapt up at the wall of a nearby building and began to run up it as though it was solid ground. As the robot's body began to fall, Izuku launched himself towards its torso, arm pulled back, intent on keeping it from being a threat to anyone else. With a scream of smash, he slammed his fist into it. The thing wasn't just launched backwards, the force of the blow actually dismantled it into 1,000 pieces that blasted away from the point of impact like the galaxy's largest shotgun blast, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Izuku landed on the ground on his feet without a stumble or step, his hard gaze on the remains of the foe villain as everybody stared at his back when the shocked Crescent mic called out when his alarm sounded. Time's up. In the monitoring room, most of the teachers were gaping in shock at what they had just seen. They'd all leapt up out of their seats when they saw the girl about to die, even though they knew there was nothing they could do. To say they were relieved by Izuku's intervention was an understatement, but that didn't remove the awe they'd felt at the show of power they'd just witnessed. Soon enough they all began to cheer, every single one of them looking forward to teaching this boy. Toshinori smiled a bloody smile of his own at the staff's reactions to his protégé's actions, but that didn't stop him from narrowing his eyes at the chimera seated beside him, who was clapping his own approval. "You had something to do with that," he whispered when he was sure nobody was paying attention. "Not only did you change the description of the zero-pointer, but now this. If Midoriya-kun is going to surpass you, Toshinori, then I want there to be no doubts in anybody's mind from the beginning that he is anything but a hero." Nezu said simply. "That goes for the staff as well as the students." His reputation starts here. Toshinori sighed, but knew better than to argue further. Besides which, he wasn't entirely against it, as long as Nezu didn't go too overboard. Holy shit, someone said quietly as Izuku turned away from his handiwork and made his way to Uraraka. He turned that thing to scrap. But he lost all his points to do it, someone said, sounding subdued. The teen who had asked the question during orientation simply watched Izuku begin removing the debris pinning Uraraka down, wheels turning in his mind frantically. Ochako stared up at her savior, eyes wide and full of awe. Midoriya-kun, she whispered as he pulled the debris off of her. Izuku knelt by her legs as she turned around, watching as she winced. He started lightly prodding her. Where does it hurt? My ankle, she said with a blush, which quickly faded as she went pale as the significance of what he'd done finally hit her. Midoriya-kun, your points. Izuku blinked up at her from where he'd been gently examining her ankle, apparently just realizing what had happened as well. Then he smiled slightly and shrugged. Worth it. Ochako felt her heart clench at the slight look of melancholy in the boy's gaze, but before she could say anything she saw a small old woman approach, tutting irritably as she handed the kids she passed some Haribo candies. She heard someone explain that this was Recovery Girl, the school nurse as she approached. Izuku nodded his head in greeting to the old woman, still focused on Ochako. Recovery Girl. Recovery Girl nodded back, not letting on that she knew the boy. Hello, young man, how is she? Twisted ankle and a decent amount of bruising, but nothing too serious, thankfully. He told her. Thanks to you, Ochako said with a sigh. Yes, good job, young man. Recovery Girl said with another nod before beeping Ochako's forehead, much to her surprise, which increased as she felt the pain in her legs vanish entirely, though she suddenly felt a bit more tired. There, that should do it. Make sure to have a good meal later. Izuku stood up and held a hand out to help her up, Ochako taking it gratefully and getting to her feet. She nodded to the nurse. Thank you, Recovery Girl. Then she turned to Izuku. Midoriya-kun, I'm so sorry. Izuku simply shrugged again, smiling gently. If I was willing to let you get hurt just to keep my points, I don't deserve to be a hero in the first place. The gathered watchers all winced as though he directed the words at them, most feeling ashamed. Then he sighed and turned to leave. Hope you passed, at least. Maybe I'll see you around. Then he began to leave as Ochako watched him go, her eyes sad. Midoriya-kun, she murmured sadly before her eyes hardened and she marched away determinedly, Recovery Girl smiling as she spotted the fire in the girl's eyes. Inko was humming happily to herself as she prepared a celebratory meal for when Izuku returned from the exam, which she had no doubt he would pass. He not only had the brains and the strength, he had the heart of a hero, and she thought that was the most important thing. After he'd woken up from his small coma she had been worried that her son was lost to her, despite his reassurances, but thankfully she'd seen those fears were unfounded. Yes, there had been some changes, but nothing that would make Izuku unrecognizable. He was more confident now, had a bigger appetite, and she'd been confused when he'd stiffened after accidentally spilling water on himself before cheering happily, but overall she was reassured that he was still Izuku, just with a few extra bits added. She smiled as she heard the door open and set the Katsudon to finish cooking before heading out to greet him, eager to hear about how he did. Her heart fell, however, at the tired look of resignation on his face. Izuku. He blinked and looked up at her before giving her a small, sad smile. I almost did it, Mom, but... She moved forward and hugged him, and she felt him sag against her. There were no tears, another change from how he used to be, but the way he slumped said everything she needed to know. She led him to the couch and sat him down, taking a seat next to him. What happened? So he told her, about acing the written portion, dominating the practical, and giving it all up to save a girl he barely knew. She smiled gently and hugged him again as he finished. I'm so proud of you, Izuku. I always knew you were a true hero, and this just proves it. She beeped the top of his head. You did the right thing. That girl's life was more important. And as nice as Principal Nezu and Recovery Girl were to us, if they're willing to punish someone for doing the right thing, then I don't want you going to that school anyway. Izuku smiled, grateful to his mother, before his mind latched onto something and he pulled back, a thoughtful look on his face. Would they really do that, though? Inko cocked her head, watching the gears turn in her son's mind. What are you thinking? Izuku's brow furrowed. Could. That's the word they used when they mentioned losing points because of the giant foe villain. Could. Not. Would. Inko got what he was driving at after a moment, her eyebrows rising. Arouse. Izuku bit his lip. Maybe. It just seems counterproductive to do something that could root out good candidates like this. I dunno. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but heroes are people who do the right thing, even when it can cause them harm. Inko said. That's what my grandfather once said. He wasn't much of a fan of pro-heroes due to how it became more of a popularity contest as things progressed. So, maybe they wanted to see if anybody fit that bill. Izuku considered it further before sighing. Well, we'll find out when I get the results in a week. Then he sniffed the air, his head turning like a bloodhound that's caught a scent. Is that Katsudon I smell? Inko smiled wryly and got up. Yes it is. Go get cleaned up while I serve it. She laughed lightly as he leapt up and made his way to the bathroom, pleased he was in a better mood. She could only hope they were right about the truth of the test. The week passed tortuously slowly, both Midoriya's nervous but doing their best to distract themselves. Izuku began making plans and designs for support equipment, first among them being the web shooters. Not having them limited his options more than he expected, and he wanted to make them as soon as possible. Eventually, however, his mother barged into his room where he was sketching schematics while listening to music, an envelope in hand. Izuku, it's here. Izuku hesitated before taking the envelope. As Inko left to give him some privacy, he let out a long, slow breath before opening the envelope, letting a small hologram projection disc fall onto his desk. Immediately an image of All Might in a suit appeared above it, much to Izuku's surprise. I am here as a projection. The man exclaimed, bombastic as usual. Huh. Izuku checked the envelope again. Wait, wasn't this from UA? Sorry for not contacting you sooner, young Midoriya. All Might said with a bow. I've been very busy with preparing for my new job. You see, the main reason I came to this city is because I will be teaching at UA this year. He said, still smiling as he always did. Izuku's eyebrows rose in surprise, not having expected All Might to have taken a teaching position. It didn't seem like the kind of thing he'd do. Of course, then he realized that with the pro's injury-imposed time limit, doing something like teaching at UA might make some sense. All Might looked off-screen. What's that? Get to the point. I have to do how many of these? Izuku couldn't help but sweat drop at the man's antics as he turned his attention back to the camera. Fine, fine. In any case, young Midoriya, you received a perfect score in the written portion of the exam. However, as you fought the obstacle villain, you received 0 points in the practical. Izuku's eyes widened in horror, but then All Might continued. Quote, ... is what you had been led to believe. He pulled a remote out of his jacket and pointed it at a screen. Behold, I was an entertainer in a past life. He said boisterously, his smile widening slightly at the small inside joke. As Izuku was trying to come to terms with what All Might was implying, he was caught by surprise when the screen showed Uraraka standing in front of Present Mic. Excuse me, but, Uraraka-san, Izuku whispered, confused. She came to see us immediately after the test. All Might explained. Why, you ask? Well, the boy who fought the big robot. Midoriya Izuku. Izuku blinked, wondering why she was asking about him. He was absolutely shocked by her next words. Can you give him some of my points? Izuku gaped, staring in disbelief as she continued. He lost all his points to save my life. I can't. He deserves to pass more than I ever could. The girl looked overcome with emotion as she pleaded with Present Mic. Whatever he needs in order to pass. Take all of them. Just let him pass. Izuku blinked, a tear rolling down his face. In spite of everything he remembered seeing during his multiple lives, he was deeply moved. Nobody had ever been willing to do something so selfless for him, Midoriya Izuku. More often than not, they'd do the exact opposite. I'm sure you, of all people, Realize, All Might said, voice earnest and passionate as he spoke. A true hero doesn't just save people by punching villains in the face. They do so by giving them hope, and inspiring them to be greater. Please, Uraraka said, bowing to present Mike, tears of emotion welling in her eyes. We weren't just looking for how well you fought in this exam, young Midoriya. All Might said as the video continued, showing present Mike patting Uraraka's head, a pleased smile on his face. I'm afraid you can't give him your points, the DJ said. But don't worry, he shouldn't need your help after all, young listener. The screen turned off, leaving All Might looking at the camera, looking more pleased than he had before. A hero course that rejects those who do the right thing has no right to call itself such. The symbol of peace declared. Some might call it lip service, but we both know better. In this job, where you risk your life every day, that is what we live by. And so, to go with the villain points, we also have rescue points. The scene shifted briefly to show a panel of judges consisting of UA teachers holding score numbers up. Midoriya Izuku, 85 rescue points. All Might appeared back on screen. And while we're at it, 50 for Uraraka Ochako. Izuku smiled widely, tears in his eyes and happiness swelling in his heart as All Might held his hand out to Izuku in invitation. You made it, my boy, he said gently, full of pride. Welcome to your hero academia. Inko, pacing nervously outside of Izuku's room, turned when the door opened. Before she could react, her son grabbed her in a hug and twirled her around, laughing happily. Knowing that could only mean one thing, she laughed as well and hugged him back, overjoyed for her son. Toshinori stood in his true form on Dagoba Beach, looking up at the night sky as he waited. He was absently aware of a couple taking advantage of the now restored beach for a romantic evening. From what he could hear, the man seemed to be trying to gather the courage to propose, but he put it out of his mind even as he wished the guy luck. Soon enough he heard the sound of feet shifting the sand behind him, but he didn't move, knowing who it was. Sure enough, his successor stopped beside him, tilting his head back to look up at the stars as well. The two men, in spite of his biological age, Toshinori could not see Izuku as anything but his equal now. Knowing what he did, stood in silent companionship for a moment, simply enjoying the serenity of the waves crashing against the surf. Congratulations, Toshinori finally said. First place in the entrance exam, smashing even my record by almost 50 points. Nobody can dispute your place at UA now. Thanks, Izuku responded, a small smile on his face. I'm sure Bakugo will have plenty to complain about, though. Toshinori let out a hum at that, having heard a bit about Izuku's childhood friend during the breaks they took when they sparred. Well, so you're aware, I had no input on who got in. I was strictly an observer. I figured you'd like to know there was no impropriety. Good to know, Izuku said with a nod. I was surprised to hear you were going to teach at UA, though I suppose it makes sense. It would be a good place to evaluate any potential successors, after all. After a moment of silence he finally spoke again. I was so busy with acclimating to my new abilities and getting ready for the test that I never got around to asking, how much time do you have left? Toshinori glanced at Izuku sharply before looking over to see the couple beeping passionately. Obviously the proposal went well. He began walking away from the happy pair, motioning for Izuku to follow with his head. After the two made their way along the beach for a bit he finally spoke. How did you know? Energy can't be created or destroyed, only changed or transferred. If I now have one for all, and most, if not all, of the energy that had been stockpiled during its existence, Izuku trailed off, leaving the implication obvious. Toshinori let out a light chuckle. I take it you once had a science background. Peter, Izuku admitted, I'm hoping to lean into that more than I could during that time. Though I wasn't a slouch as Jesse either. Couldn't be friends with Emily Pope and not pick a few things up. Toshinori was silent for a moment before answering. If I'm conservative with my time and the situations I get involved with, perhaps a year. If I got into a huge fight like the one almost 6 years ago, well, I could expend it all right then. And there's no chance of you not stopping to help catch every purse snatcher or mugger you come across, so you being conservative is unlikely. Izuku said with a nod. The symbol of peace glanced at his protege. Speaking from experience. I tended to overwork myself as Peter. Izuku said with a rueful chuckle. Made Mary Jane worry a lot. You're a lot like I was then. You act like you're all that different now. I'm betting that if our roles were reversed, Toshinori said with a smirk. Izuku nodded in acknowledgement. True enough. Well, that's why I chose you, after all. Toshinori said, a touch of pride in his voice. So, have you figured out how to explain your quirk yet? He asked after a moment. Your abilities and powers are so varied I'm having trouble seeing how they could all fall under the aegis of a single one. I'm still thinking about it. Izuku said thoughtfully. I think I'm close to a good explanation that would satisfy people, especially as to why I registered as quirkless for forever. It's not like you could tell the truth, sadly. Toshinori admitted. I considered it, but not only would I probably not be believed, I'd be sent to a mental institution if I started saying my powers came from my past lives. Izuku said with a nod. This world isn't like Peter's, where things like the existence of souls and the afterlife were pretty common knowledge, considering all the insane stuff that happened there. There'd probably be some upheaval if you were believed, too. Toshinori added with an understanding nod. Yeah, Izuku sighed. The two walked companionably for a while longer before Izuku glanced over at Toshinori. By the way, could you relay a request to Nezu-sensei for me? Toshinori quirked an eyebrow with interest as he nodded. How the did you cheat, Deku? Bakugo roared at Izuku behind the school building on their last day of junior high. Izuku stared at the raging blonde evenly, refusing to be intimidated. They'd just left the principal's office after the man had called them in to congratulate them for getting into UA, and Bakugo was predictably incensed. Not only had Izuku gotten in, but he'd shattered records reaching the top spot in the exam, leaving the other boy in the dust. You think UA is stupid enough to be fooled by someone trying to cheat? Izuku asked with a raised eyebrow. The fact that his victim wasn't cowering away from his fury as was normal just incensed the explosive blonde more. That's the only way they'd allow a quirkless loser like you in. You can't have been able to beat even the weakest of those robots, let alone enough to get first place. Believe what you want, I got in, and am going to become a hero in spite of all your attempts to keep it from happening. Then, much to Bakugo's fury, the greenhead turned and began to walk away, delivering a parting shot. I've got to wonder at their standards if they let a bully like you in, though. Izuku didn't need his spider sense to inform him of the incoming attack. If the roar of rage hadn't been warning enough, just knowing Bakugo as long as he had would have been. As it was, Izuku easily ducked under the crackling palm that shot at the back of his head, reaching up and taking hold of the outstretched arm and using it to flip Bakugo over his shoulder. The stunned blonde landed on his back with a thud, staring up at Izuku in surprise as the boy looked down at him with narrowed eyes. Don't try that again, Izuku warned softly before continuing to make his way out of school, wanting to get home and resume preparing for the first day at school. He didn't react at all to the loud explosion coupled with the scream of rage that rang out behind him. The first day of class arrived, and Izuku was preparing himself for what was sure to be a busy day. Part of him despaired at having to deal with high school yet again, even if it was a school for heroes, but he knew it was necessary. With any luck there wouldn't be too much drama to deal with. Hell, if he was really lucky then Bakugo would be in a separate class than his. Izuku paused as he was putting on his tie before laughing sardonically at the thought. As though his luck had ever been that good, in any of his lives. He was studying himself in the mirror, still chuckling lightly and feeling pleased at the way he looked in the school uniform, when he noticed a small flash of multicolored light in his peripheral vision. His eyes narrowed as he turned to where it had come from only to find his phone laying where he'd left it on his desk. Of course, what drew immediate attention was a small piece of paper laying next to it. Izuku cautiously made his way toward it, but when his spider sense failed to react he picked the paper up and read the message on it before letting out a sigh of exasperation at what it said. Check your music playlist for your reward for hitting the Getting into UA achievement. Good luck in school. You're going to need it. There was no signature, but the little drawing of a cartoon vampire told him all he needed to know. Still, As he headed out to school with a wave to his mother, the old gods of Asgard rocking out in his earbuds and making him bob his head with a smile, he found he couldn't complain too much about the old bastard's interference this time. Let's see. 1A, 1A, Izuku murmured as he searched for his classroom. UA's campus was too damn huge, but that's why he'd made sure to leave home early. He would have made it faster if he'd been able to web swing, but that wouldn't be feasible till he got his provisional license, at the least. Reaching the door for the 1A classroom, Izuku quirked an eyebrow at the size of it before letting out a breath and opening it, hoping against hope that Bakugo had indeed ended up in 1B. Remove your foot from that desk. Such an action is insulting to those who came to UA before us as well as the craftsmen who made it. A strict-looking, tall young man Izuku recognized from the entry exam's orientation barked at someone the greenette was really hoping not to see. Like I care. What middle school are you from anyway, you extra? Bakugo sneered with a smirk on his face. Izuku let his head drop and heaved a deep sigh filled with profound annoyance that conveyed a deep, all-encompassing feeling of just being done with the universe's bullshit. That's what I get for getting my hopes up in spite of everything, he muttered at the ground. Ah, you're the one who got first place. The strict boy's voice said from right in front of Izuku, making him look up. I am Iida Tenya, from Somei Private Academy. Ah, nice to meet you, Iida-san. Izuku said, ignoring Bakugo glaring hot death into the side of his head with ease. I remember you from the entrance exam. Midoriya Izuku. Indeed, it's good to see I was right about you guessing the true point of the exam, seeing as you're here. Iida said with a small smile. Izuku blinked at the mistaken assumption. Well, actually, I didn't figure it out till afterwards. Ah, Midoriya-kun. Izuku was distracted from Iida's widening eyes and slightly dropped jaw by the voice he recognized, turning to see Uraraka walking down the hallway towards the 1A door. Present Mike was right, you really did get in, she said happily, a large smile on her face. Uraraka-san, Izuku said with a smile of his own. I'm happy to see you're in my class. Yeah, I got in. I've got to thank you for speaking on my behalf, though, he said, bowing in gratitude to her, which made her flush and wave her arms. Not at all. After everything you did for me, how could I do anything else? Then she became confused. Wait, how did you know about that? Izuku changed the subject by looking down at the floor behind Uraraka. Excuse me, sir, can we help you? Uraraka blinked before turning around and jumping slightly in shock when she saw what appeared to be a yellow caterpillar with a man's face laying on its side behind her. He looked like he hadn't slept in months, and he stared at them like he wanted to get rid of them so he could go back to bed. Get in and take your seats. You're here to become heroes, not socialize. The man said, voice as tired as his eyes, as he pulled a juice pack out of his sleeping bag and drank it all in a single epic. You should already be ready for class. As Izuku and the rest entered the classroom and took the seats, the man got out of his sleeping bag and walked to the front of the class, letting them see that he had long, tousled black hair, a simple black outfit and what Izuku recognized as capture tape wrapped around his neck. The greenette narrowed his eyes, trying to remember the man's identity. You lot aren't very rational if it took you that long to get ready. The man said as he looked them over, seeming utterly unimpressed. I'm Aizawa Shota, your homeroom teacher. Pleased to meet you. His tone said that that was a complete lie. Then he pulled an outfit out of his sleeping bag and held it up for them to see. Get into your gym uniform and head out onto the grounds. Izuku's new classmates glanced at each other, wondering if Aizawa was serious, but Izuku and, unsurprisingly, Iida, immediately did as told. Izuku didn't know why Iida did so, though he guessed it was just diligence, but Izuku did because he recognized the look in Aizawa's eyes. The rest of the class quickly followed suit when they saw the two boys receive an approving grunt from Aizawa. 10 minutes later, Class 1A was out on the grounds, standing in front of Aizawa as he looked them over. A quirk assessment test, a boy with rounded elbows asked, surprised. Wait, what about the entrance ceremony, or guidance sessions? Uraraka asked next. You don't have time to waste on that stuff if you want to become heroes. Aizawa said laconically as he stepped up to what looked like a baseball pitch. UA is known for its freestyle educational system. This extends to the freedom the teachers enjoy, as well. Then he turned around and stared at the 20 teens levelly. Softball throw, standing long jump, 50-meter dash, endurance running, grip strength, side-to-side stepping, upper body training and the seated toe touch. You did all of those in middle school, correct? He asked rhetorically, prompting a few nods. Standard no quirks allowed gym tests. He said with irritation in his voice. This country still insists on prohibiting quirks when calculating those records. It isn't rational. The Department of Education is just dragging its feet. Then he focused his gaze on Izuku. Midoriya, how far could you throw in middle school? 39 meters. Izuku said promptly. Aizawa grunted and motioned for him to step up to the plate. All right, now try with your quirk, he said once the greenette was inside the circle, tossing him a softball. Do whatever you need to, just don't leave the circle. Izuku nodded, considering how to go about this. In the end it seemed obvious, so he went ahead with it. Tossing the ball up, he then snagged it with his telekinetic power, making it float in the air by his shoulder. His teacher and classmates watched as the ball proceeded to shake, a humming sound filling the air as the wind seemed to pick up and swirl around it. Bakugo gaped at first before he slowly began to redden, gritting his teeth in rage. Izuku calculated the best angle to launch the ball at for maximum distance, eyes narrowed in concentration. Then, at the last moment, he decided to add a little oomph to his throw. Now everybody watched as green electricity briefly filled the air around the ball before it was finally launched with immense force, prompting a small blast of wind to flow in a wave away from the launch site, kicking up dust and making the students shield their eyes. Aizawa calmly looked down at the meter recording the distance traveled by the ball, watching it climb. It's important for us to know our limits. When it finally stopped, he brought it up to show his students. That's the first rational step to figuring out what kind of heroes you'll be. Holy crap, 1,537.3 meters. A very short boy with hair like a bunch of grapes gawped. That's so manly, a spiky-haired redhead yelled with a grin. This is awesome. A tall, muscular boy with fat lips cheered with an equally large grin. So we can use our quirks for real now. The hero course is great. A pretty girl with pink hair and skin said with a wide smile, shaking with excitement. Aizawa's eyes narrowed. Awesome, huh? He prepared himself to pop the kid's balloon when he was interrupted by a cry of rage followed by an explosion. Deku! Bakugo screamed as he launched himself at Izuku, who had begun to walk over to the rest of the class. The greenette's eyes narrowed as he subtly shifted his stance without making it obvious, preparing himself for Bakugo's attack. Explain yourself, you shitty little ba. The blonde's words cut off when the explosion propelling him suddenly ended on its own right before Aizawa's capture tape snared the boy, pulling him back and making him drop to the ground. Izuku looked over to find the teacher's hair floating eerily as he stared intently at Bakugo without blinking. With the capture tape out of the way, Izuku caught sight of the yellow goggles hanging around his neck. That, along with the way Bakugo lost the use of his quirk, let Izuku remember who his new homeroom teacher was. What the? Bakugo cried as he struggled to get out of the capture tape. Quit struggling to get out of my capture weapon. It's made of carbon fiber and special alloy wire. And stop trying to use your quirk. Aizawa barked. I'm getting dry eye over here. Once Bakugo calmed down, glaring at Aizawa and Izuku, the pro hero continued talking as he wound his weapon in. Whatever your problem with Midoriya is, you leave it out of school, or I'm expelling you. When Bakugo blanched, the teacher turned to the rest of the class. As for all of you, if you think this is all going to be fun and games, then I guess I'll have to hammer the reality in for you. The person with the lowest score across all 8 events will be judged hopeless and expelled. There was stunned silence for a moment as everyone stared at Aizawa. Then Ochako cried out, finding her voice first. What? The girl said in disbelief as Izuku took his space next to her. It's only the first day. Even if it weren't, that's totally unfair. Unfair? Huh, Aizawa said, unimpressed. Natural disasters, highway pileups, rampaging villains, his apathetic gaze swept along the ranks of his suddenly silent students. Calamity is always around the corner. I'd say Japan, no, the world, is full of unfair things. His eyes caught Izuku's, which didn't show an iota of fear or hesitance. Heroes are those who correct all of that. He pulled his gaze from the greenette's emerald orbs. If you were hoping to spend your evenings hanging out at McDonald's, I'm sorry to tell you that for the next 3 years, UA will run you through the ringer. He gave an almost malicious smirk. That's plus ultra. Use your strength to overcome it all. He swept his gaze along the group again, finding them all giving him determined looks now. So bring it. The first event was the 50-meter dash. Izuku's turn was near the end, so in the meantime he analyzed his classmates' abilities. Several impressed him, either with their quirk's basic ability, or the way they used them. Of course, some, like Uraraka, didn't get much benefit from them in this event, but he looked forward to seeing what they were all capable of. He was exasperated to find himself paired off against Bakugo. The blonde was obviously still angry, though Izuku was hard-pressed to remember a time he wasn't, and he could tell that the other boy planned to, accidentally, blast him when he launched himself forward. Izuku snorted in annoyance and prepared himself. The instant Aizawa indicated for them to go, a split second before Bakugo blasted forward, Izuku used a telekinetic dash to launch himself halfway along the track. Then, barely letting his toes touch the ground, he used another dash to go the rest of the way, finishing in 1.89 seconds, the best time so far, much to the amazement of his classmates, and the chagrin of Iida, whose quirk of engine was literally made for fast movement. Next came the grip strength test, with Izuku once more coming out on top, his Peter-given strength alone enough to let him win without needing to resort to reinforcement or one for all. In the standing long jump, Izuku jumped high into the air before levitating himself across the distance, dropping beyond the sand track set out. In spite of himself, he couldn't help but smirk at Bakugo's shout of rage when Izuku beat him once again. He did well with the side step thanks to his flexibility and speed, but it was the first event he wasn't the best in. That went to the grape-headed boy, Mineta Minoru, who bounced along between two of the balls from his head which he'd set on the ground at dizzying speed. He was excused when they did the ball toss again, as he'd had a more than satisfactory score. Even his eyebrows went up, however, when Uraraka got a score of infinity. Damn, he said with an amused chuckle. He won the endurance running as well, outlasting pretty much everyone to the point Aizawa told him to stop so they could get on with it. His strength was shown to be great as well, once again thanks to the body granted by Peter. Everybody was awed when he lifted several tons without using his powers. The last test was the seated toe touch, and once again, the inhuman flexibility served him well, allowing him to bend over pretty much double. Though he pretended not to hear what Mineta was muttering to himself regarding that ability. Some things he just didn't want to know. All in all, Izuku came in a definitive first on 6 out of 8 events. There was pretty much no chance he'd be the one expelled. When Aizawa brought up the rankings, Izuku felt a moment of relief when he saw his name in first place. Before turning along with most of the rest of the class to look at Mineta sympathetically, Bakugo was too busy seething at the fact that he came in fourth. It wasn't the short boy's fault, really, it was simply an unfortunate effect of the fact that he barely came up to most of the teen's waists. His only impressive score was in the side step, but he was at too much of a disadvantage in the rest, dragging his score down abysmally. Even Hagakure Toru, a girl whose quirk only made her invisible and didn't help her in any of the events, had beat him through effort and the advantages being average-sized gave her. Mineta was on his hands and knees, looking like he couldn't believe what had happened. Despite the occasional comment that sent warning bells ringing in the girls' minds, they'd all seen him honestly try his best. It was hard to see that effort go to waste. By the way, I was lying about expelling someone, Aizawa suddenly said. Everyone turned to look at him mechanically to find the look of a supreme troll on their teacher's face. That was a rational deception to bring out the best in all of you. Fought. Most of the students cried out, Mineta loudest of all. Well, of course it was a lie. The very beautiful Yaoyorozu Momo said as though surprised her fellow students had believed their teacher. Izuku, meanwhile, stared at Aizawa with narrowed eyes, studying him. The teacher looked back at him impassively for a moment before turning and beginning to walk away. Anyway, We're done here. The man said as he began leaving. Your documents about the curriculum and such are back in the classroom. Give them a look. Then he paused. Oh, Midoriya. He turned and flicked a paper at the teen, who pulled it over with telekinesis. The principal says your request has been approved. Then he left. Izuku glanced at the paper, confirming what it said, before turning to Mineta. The shorter boy looked like he'd just survived death by the skin of his teeth, something Izuku was more than familiar with. He reached down to give the grape head a hand up. He didn't lie, the greenette said, drawing the attention of the rest of the class. What do you mean? Mineta asked as he took Izuku's hand, getting to his feet. He fully intended to expel anyone who didn't meet his standards, whether they came in last or not. Izuku said once the boy was up. I did some checking after I got accepted. Teachers are fully within their rights to expel students for pretty much anything, even on the first day. It's happened multiple times. There've been several complaints and even lawsuits about it, though they've been kept pretty quiet. At that everyone, even Bakugo, paled. Yaoyorozu seemed especially shaken at being proven wrong. Then why did he let me stay? Mineta asked, shocked and looking faint. At a guess. Because the possibility of you becoming a hero isn't zero at the moment, at least in his eyes. I'm sure that'll change if you screw up enough. He glanced around at his classmates, who were all intently paying attention to him, even Bakugo, who was prideful, not stupid. That goes for all of us. He'll kick us to the curb if he thinks we're not worth the effort. I've seen the type. Indeed, he'd met people like that during all his lives. Whether it was martial arts grandmasters as Ranma or clock tower mages, such as Waver Velvet as Shuru. Aizawa was the type of harsh teacher that wouldn't hesitate to kick you to the curb if he thought you weren't worth his time, but would otherwise do his damnedest to make you the best you could be if you were. We'll just need to make sure that next time something like this comes up, you've improved enough to show he made the right choice. Maybe we can find you a martial arts style suited to your size, Izuku said thoughtfully. Mineta stared up at Izuku, seeming shocked. You'd really help me out? Izuku blinked at the question before smiling. Heroes help people. The more heroes there are, the safer the people will be. Making you into a great hero helps more people than if I let you fail. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Izuku didn't notice the looks most of his classmates were giving him at those words, too focused on Mineta. If he had, he'd probably be showing more of his shy, pre-one-for-all personality. Thanks, Mineta said honestly. I expected you to be a smug asshole after all of this. Glad to see I was wrong. I'll take you up on that. As the group began walking back to the classroom, Bakugo hurrying to get away from Izuku, Ojiro Mashirao, a teen with a long, thick tail, spoke up. So you're a martial artist? Yeah, Izuku said. I know a bit. I'd like to spar with you, then. Ojiro said with a smile. Plus, if you're going to train Mineta-kun, maybe I could get in on that, see if I can pick up some more tricks. Izuku nodded amiably, a glint of interest in his eye. I'm always up for seeing new styles. Ooh, can I join too? And me. I'll definitely join in if it'll keep Aizawa-sensei from expelling me. Learning some formal martial arts probably make me that much more manly. Izuku laughed. Alright, how about we arrange a big joint training session once we have a handle on our schedule? We can all learn from each other then. There were excited cheers and agreements to that plan, and Izuku smiled, pleased to find most of his classmates so friendly. He had a good feeling about his time at UA. The 118s had changed and were grabbing their things to begin heading home soon enough. Seeing as it was the first day, it was meant to be short, more for orientation than actual classes. Of course that went out the window when Aizawa decided to test them, but now that that was done, they could all go home. Wanna walk to the station together, Midoriya-kun? Uraraka asked as she slipped her backpack on. I'm not leaving yet, Izuku said as he did the same. I have to deal with something else first. Is it about the request Aizawa-sensei said the principal approved? Iida asked as he checked his own bag. Izuku smiled. You're sharp. Yeah, I want to get that dealt with before I head home, now that I have the time. What is it? Uraraka asked curiously. Let's just say I'll be doing some extra credit. Izuku said with a smile, much to Ida's interest. After saying goodbye to his classmates, Izuku began making his way to his destination, a small spring in his step. The day had gone well. It had been nice to see that Aizawa, at the least, wasn't going to put up with Bakugo's shit, which was a distinct change from middle school. It was good to see that Ua had higher standards than the dump he formerly attended. Not that that was hard. Eventually he arrived at the thick, reinforced door of the support course's classroom, knocking on it and receiving permission to enter. Izuku smiled when he opened the door to find a room that looked more like the combination of a shop class and one of Tony Stark's more toned-down tinkering rooms than a typical classroom. Inside he found one of the pro heroes that taught at Ua, Power Loader, talking to one of the students, a pretty girl with salmon-pink dreadlocks and yellow eyes with crosshairs in them, no doubt part of her quirk. She was showing the teacher what looked to be a medium-sized gauntlet, talking animatedly. "My baby can do all of that and more, especially now that I have UA's resources to improve it. I'm impressed you made this in your house from scraps," Power Loader admitted as he looked it over. "1 second. He turned to Izuku as the girl rocked on her feet, seeming full of energy. Izuku wondered if she'd had any energy drinks. "Can I help you, young man?" "Yes, Power Loader Sensei." Izuku stepped forward and handed the teacher the note he'd received from Aizawa. "I'm Midoriya Izuku from Class 1A. I asked Nezu Sensei for permission to use the support labs, and he approved my request. Here's the note." Power Loader took the note and studied it as the girl focused her attention on Izuku. "The principal did. I haven't heard of a hero course student making his own gear, which is what I'm assuming you want to do. I may be in the hero course, but I do have some experience with building things." Izuku explained patiently. "I'm adept at physics, chemistry, engineering, and several other disciplines. I've already discussed some of the things I would be creating with Nezu Sensei and he has agreed with them." Power Loader eyed Izuku, though it was hard to tell with the excavator-like helmet on his head, before nodding. "Let me call Nezu and confirm. I'll be right back." As the hero walked away towards a phone in the back of the room, Izuku's attention was drawn to the girl when she got uncomfortably close, looking at him with wide eyes. "You're an inventor too. What kind of babies are you planning on making?" As Izuku stepped back from the girl, she was quite attractive, and way too close, he could already tell what kind of person she was. After knowing people like Emily Pope, Reed Richards and Hank Pym, among others, it wasn't hard to recognize another person whose work was their life. "First, I'm going to make some multi-purpose chemical dispensers meant for things such as urban traversal and villain containment, among others," he said as he leaned back slightly with a blush when she insisted on getting closer. "I'm Midoriya Izuku. And you are?" The girl blinked, as though the idea of introducing herself hadn't crossed her mind. "Oh, I'm Hatsume Mei," she said with a grin as she stepped back slightly, giving him some relief. "Nice to meet you, Hatsume-san," Izuku said. He motioned to the gauntlet she'd been showing Power Loader. "May I?" Hatsume nodded, looking at him in interest as he picked up, not hearing his murmur of, "Trace on," when he did so. She opened her mouth to begin explaining. "It's a multi-purpose gauntlet with a system to monitor a person's vitals, likely to report to either the wearer or a monitoring sidekick when the wearer is injured or under threat from something like poison." Izuku began, focused on what he was getting from the gauntlet and letting his imagination go to work. "It also has a taser and space for gas pellets, probably for tear gas or something similar. I'm seeing some points where you could maybe make the taser prongs into retractable claws for catching blades or doing damage. If you change the casing's metal to something like some grade 5 titanium alloy, it would make an excellent armor for blade or, if the wearer is fast enough, perhaps with a speed or reflex quirk, bullet deflection. Maybe add a knuckle duster extension to it and replace the taser tines with dischargers in the knuckles themselves to make taser gloves, which would be good for more physical heroes, to help them bring down unarmored targets faster with limited damage." He then turned to Hatsume, who was looking at him with wide eyes. "I'm noticing some points of vulnerability near the pellet holders, though. I think those should be reinforced before you go handing this out, because if they get crushed there, the gas could escape and affect the wearer." All in all, Izuku was impressed. They reminded him of Black Widow's gauntlets, but more armored, and the fact that Hatsume apparently made this from scraps told him she'd go far. The girl blinked before zooming back into his personal space, looking supremely curious. How did you get all that just from holding my baby? I'd like to know that too. Power Loader said as he approached, now apparently eyeing Izuku with more interest. Izuku stepped back once again, face slightly red. It's an aspect of my quirk. If I focus I can get information on an object by making contact, including what it's made of, strengths, weaknesses and how it generally works. It helps if I have some knowledge of the underlying principles, though. Can we trade quirks? Hatsume asked, eyes shining. Izuku blinked. I don't think that's possible. Hatsume slumped, which let Izuku get away from her and turn to Power Loader. Well, the principal confirmed you have permission to use the labs as you like, though I'm going to be supervising. The teacher said, I do want to know at least the basics of what you'll be making each time, though, same as with all my other students. That's fine, Izuku said with a smile. Is there any chance I could start to work now, since it's a short day? I'd like to get my main piece of equipment done as soon as possible. His smile widened. I could have really used it during the entrance exam, so I want to make it as soon as possible, before we begin combat training, which I'm pretty sure will be relatively soon. Me too. I want to see if I can make the modifications he talked about to my baby. Hatsume said, bouncing in place. Power Loader studied them both for a moment before shrugging. Meh, I was going to tinker some after I finished work anyway. I suppose I can do it while you're both here. As Hatsume cheered, the man turned to Izuku. What are you making, and what do you need? Izuku's smile widened and he took the coat of his uniform off, letting Power Loader and Hatsume catch sight of the service weapon, which he'd had strapped and hidden within it, as the greenette cracked his knuckles, becoming focused. My web shooters come in two parts. First, I'm going to need these chemicals mixed at this ratio. Izuku sat back in his classroom the day after Aizawa gave everyone a scare, relaxing as he listened to music and waited for class to begin, having arrived early enough that most of the rest of his classmates still weren't there. He was nodding his head to the music in his earbuds with his eyes closed, absently strumming an imaginary guitar, when he was distracted by someone tapping on his shoulder. Blinking, he removed his earphones, the music still playing clearly, and looked over to see one of his female classmates standing beside him. She was a cute girl with the look of a punk rocker, her earlobes stretched into earphone jacks. Yes, Miss Juro Kyoka, she said with a small smile. I could hear the music you were listening to. I don't recognize it, though it sounds cool. Could you tell me the band? Midoriya Izuku. And sure, he said with a smile, motioning her to take a seat in the currently empty seat next to him. I was listening to a heavy metal band called Blind Guardian. I'm not surprised you've never heard of them, since they're from the pre-quirk days. Izuku himself had originally never been a huge music fan. Oh, sure, he liked a few songs he heard, but he tended to be too focused on hero-related things to really get into it. Shuru was the same, too focused on other endeavors to give music too much notice, though he knew what he liked. He was exposed to it much more when he started living with his girls, but still never got too far into the hobby. Ranma rarely listened to music unless it related to martial arts in some way. He knew what he considered good or bad, but that was pretty much it. His life was too hectic for a non-combat focused hobby, which Izuku now knew was a real shame. Peter actually enjoyed music and had some favorite bands, but again, was never really able to indulge in the hobby due to how utterly insane his life could be. On occasion he'd lay back with MJ on a lazy day and relax while something played in the background, but those times were, sadly, rare, if treasured. That left Jessie as the biggest influence on Izuku's taste in music. She always had something playing in her office, especially after the mandatory psychiatrist that she'd forced all the senior staff to see in order to keep the previous issues that plagued the FBC from reoccurring told her she needed a hobby to keep her grounded and relaxed. Jessie had always had a preference for the heavier music. The old gods of Asgard were her favorite, but she grew her listening pool through recommendations from other people and some exploration through Spotify when she was at home, away from the oldest house. She even got into playing guitar to help her relax further. It was no exaggeration to say that music had been one of the main reasons Jessie Faden had survived as long as she had, with her sanity moderately intact. When Izuku, after his past lives became active, looked up some of Jess's favorite bands, he was saddened to see that several had either been lost to time or just never existed in his current world. He downloaded the ones he could find, but had been resigned to never listening to the likes of the old gods, among others, again, except in memories. Thankfully that annoying old vampire fixed that particular issue. Juro gained a thoughtful look on her face, obviously trying to place the name. No, I'm pretty sure I haven't heard of them. They're one of my favorite geek metal groups, Izuku said with a smile as sacred words continued to be audible from his earphones. Geek metal? Juro asked, an eyebrow rising as her lips curled into a smile. Izuku chuckled. They have songs based on fantasy novels and video games, wrote an entire concept album about the Lord of the Rings, and one of my favorite songs of theirs is a 15-minute opus about the Iliad, he said, smiling wryly. Juro nodded in agreement, obviously amused. Geek metal it is. She sat forward a bit. So they're good, then. Rather than answer, Izuku offered the girl his earphones as he restarted Sacred Worlds from the beginning. He sat back and watched as she listened with a small smile on her face, pleased to introduce someone new to some of his now favorite music. He waved to Uraraka as she walked in and made her way over to her seat, the brunette waving back as she set her backpack down before making her way over to him. Good morning, Midoriya-kun. The bubbly girl greeted happily before glancing at Juro as the girl continued bobbing her head to the music with her eyes closed. Hey, Uraraka-chan, he said with a smile. Juro-san was interested in what I was listening to. Ah, Uraraka uttered in understanding. Then she clapped her hands as she focused on Izuku. I'm so excited for our first proper day of classes. I wonder what lessons at UA are like. If nothing else, the teachers will be interesting, Izuku said with an amused smile. Indeed, this is UA, so I'm sure our education will be of the highest quality, Iida suddenly exclaimed from behind Uraraka, making the girl jump in surprise. Before anything more could be said, Juro removed the earphones and handed them back to Izuku. That was pretty cool. Not my usual thing, I'm more into punk, but still good. Don't suppose you'd mind passing me the songs you have. I think my parents might like them, especially if they're as unknown as you've made it seem. Sure thing, Juro-san. Just give me your email and I'll send them and a few others you might like when I get home, Izuku said with a smile, already planning on sending her some of the songs that didn't exist in this reality. This would be the first step to spreading their glory. Juro nodded with a smile before making her way back to her seat as Aizawa entered the room to begin class, 1A immediately rushing to their seats in order to avoid getting in trouble. Most of the day was far too normal for the 1A students, with regular classes including mathematics and English. True, the classes were all taught by pro heroes, but the novelty of that died surprisingly quickly. Everybody's excitement returned, however, when lunch ended and the class was waiting for their foundational hero studies teacher to arrive. I wonder who'll be teaching this class, Ashido wondered with interest. It must be an extremely capable hero in order to mold us into the best students they can, Iida exclaimed as stiffly as ever. I don't care as long as I finally get to kick some ass, Bakugo added with a smirk. As his classmates chatted, Izuku sat back and watched them all in amusement. He wondered how they'd all react when All Might arrived. For that matter, he wondered exactly how the enormous Ham would be making his entrance. He doubted he'd just walk in normally. He got his answer soon enough. I am. The class perked up, eyes wide and glued to the opening door. Coming through the door like a normal person, All Might exclaimed as he practically flounced through the doorway. Izuku facepalmed at his mentor's antics, but nobody noticed because they were too busy freaking out at the fact that they were going to be taught by the #1 hero. Holy shit, it's All Might. Is that his Silver Age costume? Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Hell yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So manly. All Might laughed at the reaction, fists heroically on his hips. Yes, yes, I will indeed be your heroics teacher. Let's not waste any time, however. He waited a moment for the class to calm down before holding up a card with the word battle on it. Today we will be performing a battle trial in order to get a handle on where you are and what you need to work on. After some more cheering from the students, especially Bakugo, the hero held up a remote and pressed the button. Of course, you'll need to dress for the occasion. As he spoke, multiple cases slid from spaces in the wall which had seemed normal. In accordance with your quirk registries and the special request forms you filled out, here are your costumes. The class cheered. All Might chuckled good-naturedly at their enthusiasm. Indeed. Go change. Then meet me in training ground beta. They say the clothes make the man. All Might said as he watched his students walk into view dressed in their new costumes. Stand proudly, because you're all heroes now. The students all looked at each other with smiles, admiring each other's outfits. As they did, Izuku stepped up to join the group, having fallen back to observe with a smile. Midoriya-kun, you look so cool. Uraraka exclaimed happily. Izuku glanced down at himself with a smile, pleased by his costume. He wore a very tight, emerald green Chinese shirt with a spiderweb pattern stitched in silver, over which he wore a black leather jacket that one wouldn't think would mesh with the rest of the look but did so surprisingly well, under which a holster with the service weapon sat, his web shooters peeking out of the sleeves as well. He wore somewhat loose black pants whose ends were tucked into shoes based on what Peter had worn to allow him to wall crawl. Thanks, it'll do for a first draft, he said with a smile before looking at the gravity girl. You look nice too, he said as he tried to keep his eyes from roaming. Uraraka blushed lightly, scratching the back of her head. Hee, I wanted something more like Thrydine's outfit, but they gave me something skin-tight instead. The hero course is the best, Mineta said with a smile as his eyes bounced from one girl to the other. All Might interrupted before the conversations could go on. Yes, you all look great, but we should get this show on the road. Sensei, this appears to be the same field used in the entrance exam. Iida asked from where he stood next to Izuku in a high-tech suit of armor. Will we be performing cityscape maneuvers? Nope, All Might responded. We'll be going into indoor anti-personnel battles instead. When he saw that the students were listening attentively, he continued. The highly publicized side of heroics takes place outdoors, where everyone can see it, but most of the time the villains involved in such events are small time. The savvy villains conduct their business indoors, away from the public eye. Black market deals, human trafficking, and other, more heinous crimes, are all more likely to occur hidden from the gaze of heroes and police. So, to simulate such a situation, you will be paired into teams in order to each fight another team as heroes and villains. So we won't be doing any basic training? The girl with the frog quirk, Asui Suyu, asked. You'll be learning the basics through practical experience, All Might declared. Any other questions? What determines victory? Can I just blast everyone away? Are you threatening to expel someone like Aizawa-sensei? How are the teams going to be selected? How fabulous is my cape? One at a time, my quirk isn't super hearing, All Might said, trying to get the students to calm down. Then he proceeded to pull a cheat sheet from a pocket, making Izuku sigh softly in fond exasperation. Here's the scenario, everyone. A group of villains are hiding a nuclear weapon in their hideout. The heroes have to go in and either capture the villains or secure the bomb within a limited time frame before the bomb blows. Then he grabbed a box sitting on a table nearby. And we will be deciding teams by drawing lots. Iida immediately responded, appearing shocked that such a thing would be decided randomly. Is that really the best option, Sensei? You won't always have the luxury of knowing who you'll be working with out in the field. Izuku told the taller boy. Could be a rookie hero you haven't heard of, someone from out of town, or just plain someone you don't like. This simulates that pretty well, and it'll test your ability to cooperate with others. I see. I apologize for getting ahead of myself, Iida exclaimed, bowing stiffly once again. It's fine, but let's not waste any more time, All Might said, holding the box out for them. Izuku watched as his classmates stepped forward, each taking one of the lots. When he finally took his turn, he looked down to see that he was in Team J with the boy who fired lasers from his belly, Aoyama Yuga. Excellent, All Might said as he reached into another two boxes, one labeled heroes, the other villains. Now, let's see what our first matchup is. He pulled two balls out and looked at them. Before showing them to the class. It's going to be Team H as the heroes against Team J as the villains. Izuku glanced over at Bakugo, who was in Team H with Jiro, to find the explosive blonde grinning malevolently at him. A few minutes later Izuku and Aoyama were in the building the battle would be taking place in, the large cartoon missile that was the bomb standing nearby. So, do you have any ideas on what we should do, Mon Ami? Aoyama asked as the countdown to the start of the trial began. First order of business is to get the bomb someplace defensible, Izuku said, picking the bomb up with his telekinesis and beginning to make his way to the stairs. Our best bet is putting it on the top floor. Bakugo won't be able to launch himself that high from outside, so he'll need to climb the building normally. Aoyama nodded, looking surprisingly serious despite his eternal smile. That will buy us time, but not much. It will if we trick them into thinking we have it somewhere else. Izuku said as his mind raced. Jiro-san can likely tell where we are, if what I've determined of her quirk is correct. So I want you to stay in a room on the opposite side of the building and one floor down, pacing. If Joris-san hears movement there, she'll probably assume you're guarding the bomb. Aoyama nodded in understanding. And you, I'll be another floor down, waiting in ambush. Bakugo will seek me out. Settling a score with me will be more important to him than the objective. That means you'll only have to deal with Jiro-san while I'm busy with him, if I don't manage to take her out before she can get away. It leaves me few opportunities to truly shine, Aoyama said, obviously put out. But winning is important too. Izuku reached over and patted the other boy's shoulder as he set the bomb down before moving some crates to hide it. This is only our first class. There'll be plenty of other chances to show off. Once the other boy nodded, Izuku began to lead the way out of the room. Now, let's get in position. Bakugo was pacing outside, waiting anxiously for the timer to start, grinding his teeth. Deku, gonna wreck his shit. Jiro eyed the blonde warily. He was acting like a barely leashed, rabid animal. What's your problem with Midoriya, anyway? She asked, remembering the way he'd acted the previous day during the test. None of your business. He barked. Jiro sighed, wondering what she'd done to get the loudest member of the class on her team. Whatever. We need to think up a plan. The plan is I kill Deku while you deal with the sparkling extra. Bakugo snarled. Before Jiro could respond, All Might's voice came over their earpieces. Battle start. Within a few moments Bakugo was already inside the building, screaming, Deku. Jiro sighed, slumping slightly, before making her way into the building, quickly plugging a jack into the wall, hoping to hear where they were keeping the bomb before blasting explode made too much noise for her to be able to do so. Izuku absently scratched his nose as he waited for his opponents to show up. He looked down at the stairs from his position against a corner of the ceiling, out of view unless you specifically looked up. He was considering how exactly to handle this. He could easily get the drop on Bakugo and lay him out before he could react, but he could already hear the cries stating that he'd cheated or hadn't fought fair, which was something he didn't want to deal with. Hammering the fact that he wasn't top dog into Bakugo's superiority complex with a straight-up fight would be both cathartic and productive, but not the smart play. So that really left Izuku to waver between those two options. Of course, that's when his spider sense decided to inform him of trouble. Izuku immediately dropped to the ground in a low crouch as Bakugo leapt out of the stairway, immediately launching large blasts on either side of the hallway in order to catch anybody that may be laying in wait, such as Izuku, by surprise. Alright then, cathartic way it was. Missed me, Izuku said before the blasts had even finished dissipating, launching himself into a spinning axe kick aimed at his opponent's head. Deku, Bakugo roared as he turned, only barely bringing his arm up to block. He let out a grunt as he dropped to a knee, his grenade gauntlet becoming dented as it took the hit. Izuku was impressed in spite of himself by the reaction speed. He wasn't going full out, but it was still a solid reminder that, as much of an asshole as he may be, the blonde was no slouch. From his crouching position Bakugo brought a palm up, aiming at Izuku. Izuku immediately moved as his spider sense blared, the explosion that would have hit him right between the legs sailing overhead once again. "No need to try to wreck my junk out of envy, Bakago," Izuku quipped from where he was crouched, letting his Peter side show through a bit. "Did you have fun, laughing behind my back all these years, you bastard?" Bakugo snarled as he started launching multiple explosions, hands slapping out like a sumo wrestler, an explosion being launched each time. Izuku dodged each time, eyes narrowed as he waited for Bakugo to tire himself out, not bothering to respond to such an idiotic question. His eyes caught movement behind the blonde as Jiro emerged from the stairway, wincing at the noise but starting to make her way up to the next floor while Bakugo kept him busy. Izuku clicked his tongue in irritation before launching some webbing at the arm that Bakugo had just launched an explosion from as he started pulling it back, forcing it forward and unbalancing the blonde. Then, while the Pomeranian was distracted, he launched several shots at Jiro, who wasn't expecting it and ended up stuck to the wall with a mass of webbing around her torso and pinning her arms. "What the hell?" she exclaimed, trying to get free. As Izuku turned his attention back to Bakugo, the blonde looked at him in fury. Are you not taking me seriously, you goddamn pebble?" he snarled. Izuku blinked, affecting confusion. "I'm supposed to take you seriously." Bakugo let out a howl of rage at that, bringing his gauntlet up to aim at Izuku, finger on the pin. "I'm going to kill you, Deku." Izuku's eyes widened and he leapt back as his spider sense blared. When the blonde pulled the pin, a massive explosion, far larger than Bakugo could manage on his own, roared out with a boom that shook the building from the noise alone. Seeing the blast coming his way, Izuku quickly held up a hand, not noticing the sound of a pained scream that was almost drowned out by the blast in the moment, 7 pink petals of a flower appearing in front of him, forming a shield that stopped the explosion from hitting him, the displaced energy flowing around his form and blasting the wall behind him apart. When everything was over, Izuku allowed raw eyes to dissipate, letting him see just how much damage Bakugo had caused. He was vaguely aware of All Might shouting in their earpieces to stand down, but he was distracted by something much more immediate. Jiro was sobbing and whimpering in pain from where she was stuck to the wall, tears of pain rolling down her cheeks as blood trailed from her ears. Immediately Izuku realized what the immense explosion must have done to her and he rushed over to her, ignoring Bakugo. "Jiro-san," he called, stopping in front of her and preparing himself to help her down so she could get to Recovery Girl. "We're not done, Deku." Bakugo snarled behind him, obviously preparing to attack him again. Izuku's eyes narrowed in fury and he turned with blinding speed, sweeping the arm reaching out to him aside hard enough to dislocate it, then grabbing the blonde's face even as he began to cry out in pain, swinging him around to smash the back of his skull against the wall, knocking the other boy out and letting his body drop to the floor. He ignored the fallen boy and turned back to Jiro, immediately bringing a bottle of specially made solvent out of a pocket in his jacket and using it to remove the webbing binding the girl. "I'm sorry, Jiro-san. Don't worry, I'll get you to Recovery Girl in a moment," he whispered to the girl, who didn't seem to hear him. When she looked at him as the last of the webs dissolved, obviously pleading for him to make the pain stop, he smiled gently and wiped her tears to soothe her before picking her up in a princess carry. He turned to find All Might behind him. "Let's take these two to Recovery Girl, young Midoriya," All Might said as he picked Bakugo up. "I already told young Aoyama to head to the monitoring room." Izuku nodded before beginning to make his way out of the building, sighing at how that had gone. He'd just hoped to teach Bakugo a very necessary lesson, not cause the whimpering girl in his arms such immense pain. Really, you'd think he'd be used to things going wrong for him already. As Izuku and All Might walked to Recovery Girl's office, the larger man glanced at his successor. "How would you recommend I handle young Bakugo's actions, Izuku?" he asked softly, trying to avoid being overheard. The brunette glanced at All Might, reminded that the man had no experience teaching, so it wasn't too surprising he'd ask for advice, especially as Izuku had mentioned he'd been a teacher a few times before in a couple of his lives. Glancing down to make sure the still softly whimpering Jiro couldn't make anything out through the hopefully temporary deafness she was enduring, he began to give his opinion on what Bakugo needed, including the why, as he knew that would help the man be more informed in the reasons for the actions he should take. When they walked through Recovery Girl's door, the woman tutted and directed them to set the teens on the beds. "Somehow I'm not surprised that you already brought me some patients," she said, glancing between the two. "Which would you say is most in need of my help?" she asked, though she was already moving toward Jiro. "Jiro-san likely has ruptured eardrums," Izuku reported quickly. She was only a meter or so away from a massive explosion, and if her hearing is as sensitive as I think it is. Recovery Girl nodded as she pulled an otoscope out of a drawer, bringing it to the punk girl's right ear to check. "Yes, there's damage, but thankfully it isn't too severe. She'll be back to normal in a moment," she said before beeping the teen, whose whimpers immediately died away as she relaxed, the pain leaving. Once the old woman was satisfied, she pulled back and spoke softly. "Can you hear me all right, young lady?" Jiro nodded, bringing her hands up to her ears, as though checking they were intact. "Yeah," she grimaced when she felt the drying blood that had trailed down the sides of her face, Recovery Girl quickly giving her a tissue to clean it off with. "Thank you so much. I haven't felt pain even close to that bad since the first time I went to a concert without bracing myself." She bowed to the nurse in thanks before doing the same to Izuku, much to his surprise. "And thank you for helping me, Midoriya-kun," she said. "I appreciate it." Izuku scratched the back of his head. "Don't worry about it, Jiro-san. It was partly my fault you were in that position in the first place." Then he turned to Recovery Girl. "Bakugo has a dislocated shoulder and I smashed the back of his head against a wall hard enough to knock him out, so he has a concussion at the least." At her glower he raised his hands slightly nervously. "I can help you set his arm so you can heal him, if you want." The woman sighed before nodding. "If you would." As Jiro watched, Izuku asked All Might to hold Bakugo still before quickly and expertly setting the joint with a small crack, the blonde boy jerking from the pain even if he didn't wake just yet. "Done." Without another word, Recovery Girl moved to beat Bakugo's cheek. There was no indication that her ability had done anything till Bakugo began to stir, and Izuku quickly stepped back, just in case. His caution was warranted when the blonde began to look around groggily, his eyes stopping and locking onto the green-clad boy. As the memory of what had happened right before he lost consciousness hit him, he snarled in fury and began to get out of bed. "Deck," only to be interrupted by a large hand landing on his shoulder. He turned to instinctively yell at whoever had done it, only for his words to die in his throat when a very unamused All Might met his gaze. "Young Midoriya, would you be so kind as to take young Jiro back to the monitor room? I believe I need to have a word with young Bakugo," he said seriously, his normal smile absent. Izuku nodded and opened the door for Jiro, who gave him a small smile as she left. He closed the door as he followed, leaving a mulish-looking Bakugo alone with All Might and Recovery Girl, the latter of which had gone into the back area of the nurse's office after she was sure the boy would be fine. There was a moment of silence before All Might, mindful of his limit, spoke. "Why are you here, young Bakugo?" "Because Deku caught me by surprise," the younger blonde said, teeth gritting together so hard they were in danger of breaking at having to say that. "I meant here, at UA," All Might clarified. When Bakugo looked at him in confusion, he continued. "It can't be because you want to be a hero, because what I saw earlier was more worthy of a villain." Bakugo paled, staring at the serious hero with wide eyes, feeling like he'd just been punched in the gut. "Wah. Your teammate was injured during the fight, by your own actions, and rather than assist her, especially as I'd already called the match off, you completely ignored her suffering and my orders in order to continue a pointless grudge match against young Midoriya, who was actually trying to help her." All Might went silent for a moment to punctuate his words before delivering the blow that he knew was needed even without Izuku's coaching. At this point in time, even were young Midoriya quirkless, I would say he was leagues closer to being a hero than you are. "You can't be serious," Bakugo yelled, jumping out of bed to stare at All Might in absolute shock. "Deku has shown the mentality and will of a hero since the day I met you both during the sludge villain incident," All Might said firmly. All he lacked at the time were the skills needed, and that's what UA is meant to be for. The older blonde wanted to sigh when he saw that Bakugo was still in denial over his words, absently wondering how his colleagues dealt with headstrong teenagers all the time. Maybe he could ask some of them for pointers. Still, for now, they really needed to get back to continue the lesson. He was wasting his time too much. You'll be serving detention at the end of the day, young Bakugo. I'll let Aizawa know so he can arrange it. I suggest you fix your mindset, or you won't last long here. With that, All Might turned and began heading for the door. Now come on, we're wasting class time. Bakugo stared after his departing teacher, his mind unable to process what the greatest hero in the world had just told him. It was so contrary to pretty much everything he'd ever been told in his life, it just didn't seem to want to click into place. Fists clenched at his sides as he ground his teeth impotently, Bakugo stomped after the pro, mind still trying to handle the latest blow to his worldview. When Izuku and Jiro arrived at the monitoring room their classmates were in, they were immediately surrounded by concerned teens wanting to see if the girl was okay. I'm fine, Jiro assured them loudly over their barrage of questions. Recovery girl fixed me up good as new, she said as she absently brought a hand up to fiddle with her earphone jacks. Seriously, that woman is a miracle worker. Thank goodness, Yaoyorozu said, a hand over her heart in relief. Yeah, that looked like it must have been really painful. Kirishima said, I mean, we don't get sound here, but it was pretty obvious anyway. Jiro winced. Yeah, I'm staying far away from Explodo Boy in the future. It's nice to know we've got at least one gentleman in the class though. Ashido said with a grin as she elbowed Izuku playfully. Izuku just looked at her, amused. Well, I couldn't just leave her there, could I? Especially when it was partly my fault. Thanks again, Jiro said. Before he could respond, All Might walked in with a sullen-looking Bakugo following behind him. Their teacher immediately clapped his hands to get their attention, not that it was necessary. Now that we're all here, let's get into the after-action assessment of the first battle trial. We've lost enough time as it is. He looked around at the teens. Now, who would you say was the MVP? Midoriya, was the almost unanimous response, only Bakugo remaining silent. Though he growled at the assessment. All Might nodded. I agree, but I need to hear reasons why. Yaoyorozu stepped up with her hands raised. If I may. Aoyama-san gave us the details of what Midoriya-san's plan was while we were waiting for your return. It was very well thought out considering the information he had available. That and his obvious combat skill, and the fact that he managed to incapacitate Jiro-san while holding his other opponent off are also points in his favor. Then she frowned slightly. I would say that the only negative issue is that he appeared to be holding himself back and dragging the fight with Bakugo out, if the way he quickly and decisively ended things later was any indication. If he hadn't done so, then Jiro-san likely wouldn't have been injured as seriously. She gave Izuku an apologetic look at her words, but he simply nodded in agreement. An excellent assessment, young Yaoyorozu. All Might said, smiling proudly. Anything else? He asked, glancing around, receiving only shakes of the head. Very well. Let's get on with the rest of the trials, shall we? We need to make up for lost time, he said as he began drawing the lots. They managed to get through the rest of the matches without any further real incidents before All Might's time was up, if barely. The first one after Izuku's was Team A, composed of Kaminari and Tokiyami, as the villains versus Team D, which was Uraraka and Hagakure, as the heroes. The girls managed to come out ahead when the Gravity Girl managed to get her teammate to one of the upper windows, allowing her to search the upper floors while Uraraka searched the bottom floors and acted as a distraction. Neither of the boys had any way to detect the invisible girl, so even though they left Kaminari to guard the bomb while Tokiyami dealt with any obvious intruders, Hagakure had managed to touch it before he realized she was there. The next match was Team E, which had Yaoyorozu and Shiro as villains, against Team B, made up of Iida and Kota as heroes. Kota used the help of his animals to find the bomb relatively quickly, but while he'd been doing that, the villain team were filling the stairways with obstacles and white traps made up of Shiro's tape alongside flashbang mines and other devices created by Yaoyorozu. Thanks to the traps and the relatively cramped quarters, Iida was unable to use his full capabilities. Kota tried to help by sending birds to harass their opponents, but they were scattered when Yaoyorozu produced a noise gun to scare them away. After that it was relatively easy for Shiro to contain the two. Next, Team C, made up of Todoroki and Shoji as the villains, faced Team G, which contained Kirishima and Ojiro as heroes. It was a relatively quick affair as Todoroki waited for Shoji to report that their opponents had entered the stairwell before freezing them, trapping them. Kirishima managed to break out of the ice due to his hardening and was in the process of freeing his teammate when the villain team attacked, Todoroki quickly refreezing Kirishima in even thicker ice, allowing Shoji to bind them with the capture tape they'd been provided. The last match was between Team I, Sato and Mineta, as the villains, against Team F, Asui and Ishido, as heroes. The villain team had a reasonably solid plan of having Sato protect the bomb while Mineta trapped the stairwells with his pop-off balls much like Shiro and Yaoyorozu had, but there were 3 issues with that. One was that the short boy couldn't make use of as many of the balls as would have been necessary, his scalp bleeding after just one set of stairs were dealt with. The second was that, even then, Ishido could melt the balls with her acid. It required one of her stronger variants, which caused her some trouble as well, but she could manage, and Mineta didn't have that many options for direct combat after he'd overused his quirk. The third was that Asui could scale walls, and rather than follow her teammate into the building she searched it from the outside, peering through windows for the target. Once she spotted Sato with the bomb, a few sugar cubes ready for consumption in his hand, she burst through the window, wrapped her tongue around the cubes and ate them, before giving him a punishing double kick to the chest, sending him flying. Then she leapt for the bomb before he could recover, ending the exercise. Thanks to the after-action assessments All Might ran, in which Yaoyorozu pointed out what had been done well and what not, and Izuku offered suggestions for ways to improve or do things differently in the future, the whole class, even Bakugo, felt that they had learned quite a bit. All Might gave them all a proud smile as he congratulated them all on their performance before rushing out with a call that class was over. The class was a bit confused at the abrupt end but shrugged it off, heading back to their classroom after changing in order to grab their things and head home, all the while discussing how the training had gone. "You're so amazing, Yaomomo," Ishido exclaimed perkily as the class was discussing the matches. "The way you set up all those traps and shut your opponents down was awesome." "Yaomomo," Yaoyorozu mumbled questioningly, blushing lightly. And it was nothing. I'm just blessed to have such a versatile quirk. A quirk like that would be useless in most people's hands, Yaoyorozu-san. Izuku told her with a smile as he checked his bag to make sure he had everything. You must have both a prodigious intellect and done a lot of hard work to get to the point you can make complex devices like mines, if what you've said of your quirk is true. Yaoyorozu's blush deepened at the praise. Well. You were awesome too, Midoriya-kun, Uraraka exclaimed with a wide grin. The way you fought Bakugo was great. You're obviously talented. Indeed, Ojiro said with a smile. I'm looking forward to whenever we start our martial arts sessions. Maybe this weekend, Izuku said. I'll scout out a place where we can train. I've been using Dagoba Beach as my training ground, but that might not be the best choice. Why not? I'd love to go to the beach. Hagakure exclaimed, bouncing lightly on her feet. Fighting and training in martial arts on sand isn't a great idea, at least if you're a beginner. Izuku informed her with a smile. The footing is too uneven and treacherous. It might be good if you're practicing how to fall correctly and stuff, but otherwise we need something more solid. Makes sense, Kirishima said. Don't want to place your foot wrong and twist an ankle or something. Well, Yaoyorozu began, slightly unsurely. I have a dojo and gym attached to the house I'm living in. My parents had it installed so I could train at home more easily. I wouldn't mind having everybody over to train there. Are you sure? Izuku asked. I mean, you've known us for 2 days so far. Yaoyorozu shook her head with a smile. True, but what better way to get to know everyone? Besides, it's only right that I help everyone improve if I'm able to. Isn't that basically what you're doing, Midoriya-san? Izuku studied her before smiling widely. You're going to be an amazing hero, Yaoyorozu-san. He said simply, making the tall girl blush heavily. All right, We'll have a training session for whoever wants to learn or improve in martial arts at Yaoyorozu's house this weekend. Sound good, everybody? He asked, looking around at his classmates, the majority of which cheered happily in agreement. With that, everyone began to head home, eager to relax after the strenuous day they'd had. Kyoka sighed as she walked into her room, happy to be able to relax. Setting her bag aside and shedding the coat of her uniform, she lay down on her bed and let herself go limp, eyes closing. For a few minutes she just lay there, feeling herself relax fully for the first time since the start of the heroics class. Wincing at the memory, she lightly rubbed her ear, imagining she could still feel the pain. With another sigh, she sat back up and picked up her guitar, absently strumming it, enjoying the sound of the notes she'd made. More than the pain, the inability to hear she'd endured for the minutes it had taken Midoriya to get her to Recovery Girl had been awful. For a brief time she'd thought she was going to be permanently deaf, which was a horrifying thought to such a musically inclined girl. A few minutes later, after the strumming had helped her relax, she turned her computer on before beginning to change out of her school uniform. It was as she was pulling on some loose shorts that she received a notification of a received email. Curious, she opened it and was surprised to see it was from Midoriya, with a very, very large amount of music files attached. Hello Jiro-san. As promised, here's the music I said I'd send you. Some of it might not be to your taste, but I figured I'd pass it all along in case your parents were interested, since you mentioned they're interested in music as well. Hopefully this'll help make up for my involvement in your injury. I hope you enjoy them. Midoriya Izuku. P.S. You mentioned you're a fan of punk rock. Might I recommend Bad Religion to start off with? Kyoka smiled, touched he'd remembered. Quickly downloading all the music to her computer, she opened up her music player and started playing You, by Bad Religion as she finished pulling a shirt on, head quickly banging to the music. She'd have to find a way to repay him later on. What is All Might like as a teacher? A woman practically screamed point blank in Izuku's face as she shoved a microphone up to catch anything he said. He blinked, a sweat drop trailing down his head. He'd hoped he'd be able to make it to the school gate without being accosted, but evidently that was foolish to expect. The area in front of UA's main gate was swarming with reporters. Izuku had known when he saw the headline in one of his news apps that All Might was teaching at UA that there would be a response, and considering how the media hounded the man, how the hell had it taken so long for them to find out? But this was approaching ridiculous. Glancing around, hoping for inspiration on how to get out of this situation, he saw Yaoyorozu being accosted as well nearby, her face broadcasting her discomfort for any that cared, which unfortunately didn't include the press. And Izuku was pretty sure he saw Mineta trying to avoid getting trampled by inattentive reporters only a few feet away, though his perverted side apparently had enough control to make him take the opportunity to look up some skirts despite the risks. Making a mental note to himself to discipline the short boy later, Izuku came up with a plan and began to speak into the microphone in his face, a PR-friendly smile he'd practiced often as Peter on his face. It really was surprising how necessary such a smile was to even a masked vigilante. Well, as a member of UA's management course, I'm obviously not being taught by him, but I'd say that the mere fact that All Might is teaching the latest batch of heroics students is going to give them a significant boost in marketability right out of the gate. Izuku almost smirked as he saw the rude reporter immediately lose interest, face going slack while keeping enough of a smile on to not seem impolite, though he was mildly surprised to see some other nearby reporters were looking mildly interested in what he was saying. Thankfully Yaoyorozu seemed to spot the ball he'd left and ran with it. Indeed, she said, drawing herself up in order to appear more dignified. I estimate that when the current first years graduate, their brand will be approximately 20% more valuable thanks to the simple fact that they were personally instructed by All Might. Much to Izuku's surprise, Mineta then took the ball from Yaoyorozu and rushed the end zone. Even the least talented members of the classes he taught will likely start off 10 spots higher in the national rankings just due to their association with All Might alone. He said, sounding surprisingly confident, drawing more than one surprised look from those that hadn't noticed him. Once we found out that he was teaching heroics, my classmates in Class J started theorizing on the ramifications and how we would manage them. Unless one of them does something obscenely stupid or disgraceful, they'll be great heroes. Izuku was mildly impressed by Mineta's acting. The near slip was an inspired way to sell the illusion. Something told the Greenette that the skill had been cultivated for less than noble purposes, but he couldn't complain about the results. Several reporters wrote something down as they muttered thank yous and moved away from the three in search of more prey, letting them finally move towards the gates unimpeded. "Thanks for backing me up, guys," Izuku said with a smile once he was reasonably sure that the press wasn't going to try to jump them again. "Hey, it was your idea," Mineta said with a shrug, though a small, prideful smirk was on his face. "Seemed like our best chance of escaping the vultures." "Indeed," Yaoyorozu said with a smile of her own, her gaze landing on Aizawa and Present Mike, who were heading for the gate, no doubt to rescue the other students. "I'm impressed by the strategy you came up with to escape. I'm just thankful that I have some familiarity with business matters so I could properly support you." Hearing the loud "Heeeeey" of Present Mike catching the reporter's attention, the three hurried forward, wanting to get as far away from that mess as possible. "Those reporters were really annoying," Shiro said to Aoyama and Kaminari as he lounged in his chair. "You said it," Kaminari said. "I almost used my quirk on that guy that was practically hugging me to try to get a quote." "Indeed, they were most inelegant in the quest for a story." Aoyama agreed, his perpetual smile not hiding his distaste for what they'd experienced. "I'm pretty sure it's only the fact that the teachers arrived that kept Bakugo from blowing them all up after they mentioned a sludge villain incident he was involved in," Asui said bluntly to Hagakure and Uraraka. Izuku glanced over at Bakugo to find that he was quietly seething in his seat, eyes locked out the window, glaring at the school gate. In this case Izuku couldn't really blame him. Being reminded of the most helpless moment in your life like that was bound to piss anybody off, especially someone as proud of his strength as Bakugo. In that moment it must have seemed like that event would dog him for the rest of his life. All talking ceased when Aizawa entered the room, the students rushing to their seats, wanting to avoid the man's wrath. The perpetually exhausted-looking pro eyed them all before letting out a mildly approving grunt. "We're behind thanks to the mess the parasites outside caused," he said, not bothering to hide his contempt of the media. "Thankfully we're only going to be focusing on some classroom business this period." Everyone tensed, wondering what he was referring to. Ever since Izuku had told them about Aizawa's practices, something several of them had verified independently, they were all extremely wary of anything that deviated from the norm in case it was another way for the man to find an excuse to expel one of them. Aizawa continued speaking, his laconic voice not giving any hint as to whether he'd noticed how they'd reacted to his words or not. "You all need to choose a class representative." The tension in the room was immediately dispelled, several of them letting out sighs of relief at the fact that they'd be doing something so normal. Then, once what he'd said sank in fully, the class began clamoring, hands raising to catch Aizawa's attention. Ooh, I can do it. I think you will find that I am the obvious choice. Come on, it's gotta be me. I'm the only one who should be taking the job, extras." Izuku sat back, amused as he watched everyone shout about their willingness and qualifications to be the leader of the class, which in the heroics course was a more involved job than it would be in other schools or departments. The class representative would be the person in charge of leading the class during group exercises and activities when the teachers weren't taking command themselves. Apparently he wasn't the only one to realize that, seeing as Iida had stood up and began to shout to be heard by the rest of the class. "You are all failing to realize what this means. This is a significant responsibility, and only someone qualified that everyone can respect and follow should have such a position. That's why I believe that the only way this should be decided is through a democratic vote," he says while holding his hand up higher than everybody else. Sato said, amused, as Iida was indeed holding his arm up so high it was literally vibrating. Then he shrugged. "He's right though. We need someone most of us can agree on, since they'll be giving us orders to follow. That's what makes the most sense." Quote, "Sensei, should we go with Iida-kun's suggestion?" Kirishima asked as he put his own hand down as the others murmured in agreement with Iida and Sato's words. Aizawa was already curling up in his sleeping bag in the corner of the classroom. I don't care how you do it as long as it's done by the end of the period and you don't wake me up. There were some sweat drops at that, but in the end the class proceeded with the election, each one putting the choice down on a piece of paper to be collected later by Iida, who was acting as election official, seeing as it was his idea. Izuku considered his choice carefully. Iida would be good when it came to organization and discipline. His earnest, diligent and strict personality would serve that role well. However, he found it unlikely that his classmates would listen to him much, especially at first. He would probably work best as vice representative, or a support role like secretary, where he could put his talents to use and let someone else wrangle the students when needed. Most of the others he deemed unsuitable since their personalities didn't fit the job requirements, at least as far as he'd seen, and despite their initial enthusiasm for the idea he was pretty sure they'd eventually grow to chafe under the responsibility of the role. Bakugo was right out. That could only be a disaster. In the end Izuku ended up writing down Yaoyorozu's name. She was very diligent as well, but had a less difficult personality, and was already very interested in helping her classmates, as she'd shown when she'd offered her home for their martial arts training. He placed the folded slip of paper into the bowl Iida brought around before sitting back, curious as to who would be chosen. Iida had diligently written out everybody's names on the chalkboard before beginning to count the votes, putting a tally next to each name that came up. The room was quieter than usual as they waited to see who would be chosen, though there was quite a bit of anxious fidgeting. Izuku was flattered when he saw a tally appear next to his name, a small smile on his face. That smile faded to be replaced by incredulity as another tally appeared. Then another. By the end Izuku was gaping in surprise when he saw 9 tallies next to his name, the next closest amount being Yaoyorozu, with 3. Iida placed the chalk down once he was done, giving his own name, completely free of tallies, a brief, frustrated look, before turning to the class. According to the votes, Midoriya will be class representative, with Yaoyorozu in the position of vice representative. Most of the class cheered even as several good-naturedly lamented their loss. Bakugo's eyes were fixed on the single tally next to his name, obviously from the vote he cast for himself. His teeth gritted as he realized that none of his classmates had considered him, and that nearly half had instead chosen Deku. It was so contrary to almost his entire life experience that he was having trouble processing it. Izuku got up and made his way to the front of the class along with a lightly smiling Yaoyorozu, still somewhat stunned. Despite his memories and knowledge from his previous selves, he was still Midoriya Izuku at heart, just as he'd told his mother, and that meant that the idea that he'd be trusted and respected enough for something like this hadn't even crossed his mind. All of his current life's experiences said that it would never happen. Taking his place in front of the blackboard, Yaoyorozu on his left, he turned to face his classmates before smiling softly. "Thank you for trusting me with the position, everyone. I don't know why you'd choose me, but now that you have, I promise to do my best to live up to it." "You don't know why?" Kirishima asked, seeming honestly confused. "Dude, you've basically been acting as the class representative since the first day." When Izuku turned his gaze to the redhead, the other boy scratched the back of his head. "I mean, I was gonna vote for myself, but then I stopped to think about what I know of the rest of the class even though we've been in classes less than a week, and it was obvious. Just the first day you helped Mineta and told us all about what we should watch out for. You even offered to train us that very day, even though you didn't even know some of our names yet." Hagakure said, her body shifting as she spoke to show how animated she was. "There's also how good you were at planning and directing Aoyama during the battle trial. Not to mention that you put helping Jiro first before anything else when she was hurt." Uraraka said peppily. "Yeah, you definitely got my vote because of that," Jiro said, nodding in agreement. "There's also how you worked with Yaoyorozu to give everybody advice after each match. It was almost like you have experience at being a teacher," Ojiro added. "So yeah," Kirishima said with a shrug and a smile. "When you really think about it, you're the obvious choice. You've already been doing the job. We're just making it official." The entire class cheered in agreement at that, and Izuku couldn't help but smile. "Thanks, everyone. I won't let you down. I promise." After the excitement of the class representative selection, the day proceeded normally after homeroom. When lunch came around, the students eagerly made their way to the cafeteria in order to enjoy Lunch Rush's excellent food. Izuku stood patiently in line, waiting for the katsudon he'd requested to be ready. While he did so, he decided to observe the other students in the cafeteria. It was as he was looking around and absently wondering which were fellow members of the heroics course that he realized he knew absolutely nothing about the members of Class 1B. The thought stuck in his head for a moment. True, from a bit of research he knew that the two classes would be having some joint activities throughout the year to work together, but the fact that he didn't even know what they looked like struck him as odd. When his katsudon was ready, rather than head directly for where Uraraka was waving for him to join her, he made a detour to the table holding most of 1A's female students, where Ashido and Hagakuri were apparently discussing something while Yaoyorozu listened in and occasionally provided her own input, and Jiro bobbed her head to the music she was listening to as she ate. Yaoyorozu-san. The girl paused eating her sashimi and turned to look up at him. Yes. Before anything else could be said, an alarm suddenly started to ring throughout the room and, likely, the entire school. Security level 3 has been broken. All students, please evacuate in an orderly fashion. Izuku knew exactly what would happen once that announcement came, and he was proven right when his fellow students immediately began to rush towards the exit in a panic. Part of him wondered why organizations even bothered with emergency drills. Even the FBC hadn't been able to completely deal with the instinctual urge people had to turn into wild animals when frightened, no matter how many drills for dimensional collapse, temporal destabilization, zombie apocalypse, elder god awakening or alien invasion he'd had them run when he was Jesse, though they generally reasserted themselves quickly once the initial panic passed, thankfully. As the thought went through his mind, the girls quickly got up, and he saw Uraraka and Iida approaching as well, the brunette looking a bit adorable with her cheeks puffed out slightly due to the food still in her mouth and a couple of grains of rice stuck to her face. "What's security level 3? Iida asked a passing upperclassman seriously. "It means that someone has infiltrated the building," the boy exclaimed, his voice slightly high-pitched with fear. "That's never happened in all 3 years I've been here." Then he resumed running, joining the growing pileup at the entrance. Izuku's classmates had already begun to follow, joining the mass of people trying to get out, but Izuku fell back. Looking around the packed entrance, he frowned when he saw the students dangerously pushing and shoving each other in their panic. He needed to get more information so he could deal with the situation. Quickly leaping over the crowd's heads, he stuck to the wall above the doors to the exit hallway before crawling along the ceiling above the throng. Moving next to a window, he lowered himself so that he could look out of it without any issues, and immediately felt any trepidation he might have had at the apparent attack turn into annoyance. Peter may have been a member of the press for some time, but that just meant that he'd seen some of their worst sides, especially what with JJJ trying to smear him at any opportunity. So while he could respect the more dedicated and honorable journalists, the ones that put their lives on the line to bring people the information they needed, he really hated the, to quote Aizawa, parasites. So when Izuku saw that the entire ordeal was thanks to the fact that the press somehow got onto the grounds and were apparently trying to invade the school building proper in their zeal to get a story on All Might, it took quite a bit of self-control to avoid doing something unpleasant. Still, something tickled at his instincts, telling him there was more to this than he was seeing, but for the moment he ignored it in order to focus on the immediate situation he was dealing with. He turned from the window in order to try to calm the students now that he knew there wasn't any danger. "Stop," he yelled, but couldn't make himself heard through the panicked babble and stomping of feet. He began getting more worried now that he looked at the stampede properly. The students were even more panicked than he would expect. It was the kind of panic that inevitably got someone hurt or killed. It would only be later that he would realize that part of what was fueling the panic was the fact that school that was considered one of the most secure institutions in Japan, even counting prisons and government agency headquarters, had been breached. It might not be a conscious thought, but that little bit of information was hitting the panic button with greater than usual force. His first thought after yelling failed was to draw the service weapon and let out a shot or two in order to get everyone's attention, but that was quickly discarded. The sound of powerful gunshots so close by might just make them panic more. Then he was out of time to think when he saw what he feared would happen did so. Hagakure was trying to make her way through the crowd, which was made more difficult due to her stature and invisibility. So when she suddenly tripped over the leg of someone that had been pushed back by another student, it was no surprise. Unfortunately, Hagakure was one of the worst people that could have happened to, barring Mineta. Izuku's perception of events sped up, much like it always had whenever he'd been in a dangerous situation, no matter the incarnation. He could see Hagakure's body hit the floor, bouncing slightly as she cried out. He could see an especially large upperclassman with the head of a hippo stumble over the sudden obstacle, instinctively lengthening his stride to maintain his balance. He could see that the large foot was heading right where Hagakure's head would be, unseen by the boy that was inadvertently going to kill her. Within a fraction of a second he was there, slipping seamlessly between the packed students, Hagakure's body in his arms in a princess carry before she could be stomped to death. He was back in the air, leaping over the heads of the students with inhuman grace before the hippo student's foot had touched the floor and landing on the wall above the doorway leading out onto the grounds, sticking there while still holding Hagakure securely. Below him several upperclassmen were shoving each other in order to get out the door first. Enough was enough. Back during his life as Ranma, Nobiki had roped him into watching some anime with her out of curiosity as to whether he could reverse engineer fictional fighting styles for his own use. That and she just wanted someone to watch anime with. As usual she'd come at it from a financial perspective as well, thinking that being able to market the ability to learn to fight like a Naruto ninja would be great for bringing in students, but he'd been admittedly intrigued by the idea anyway, and so had begun to watch Naruto and One Piece, among others. While quite a few of the techniques and skills were too unrealistic for him to use, or required spiritual, magical abilities he just had no real talent for, he had indeed developed quite a few moves out of the experience. One of the things he'd tried to replicate had been Luffy's Conqueror's Haki and/or killing intent as it had been shown in anime such as Naruto and others. He'd managed to make his own version, which Kasumi had named Kami no Sabaki, or God's Judgment, because after he used it all the recipients, including Kasumi and Nobiki, who had been in the area of effect the first time it was used successfully, said it felt like some greater power that could squash you utterly was observing you, judging you, and finding you wanting. The first time Ryoga had experienced it, despite the huge amount of willpower Ranma knew the eternally lost boy had, no matter his somewhat simple mentality, he had, briefly, dropped to his knees, almost as if in supplication before a deity. Of course, it had never worked the same on him again, as he knew what to expect, and Cologne and Haposai had only ever been mildly inconvenienced by it. But it was still a potent ability when he wanted to make sure whoever he was facing damn well knew he was serious about whatever he was saying or doing. It had been a great help to him several times when it came to pushy new fiancés or suitors, and the occasional troublemaker trying their shenanigans. He'd even, accidentally, started a small cult amongst the students of Furinkan dedicated to worshipping him. That had been a real pain in the ass. Nobiki'd laughed herself sick even as Akane had whacked him on the head. Izuku focused his unbreakable will and endless determination. Despite its intimidating name, the basis of the technique wasn't exactly in trying to impose your will on others. It was making yourself radiate a presence that declared to the world at large that you would not be stopped, would not be denied, and had to be, if not obeyed, then at least listened to. It was not something those weak of heart, those who preferred to follow rather than lead, could do. It required, as stated, will and determination. Even had Izuku never awakened to who he had once been, he likely could have wielded the potent technique through just his sheer willpower. Now he was being backed up by the determination of 4 of the most stubborn people in the multiverse. The result was a foregone conclusion. In an instant every person in the hallway stopped. Izuku wasn't using his technique at its full power. He didn't feel it was needed when he was just trying to get their attention, but even so some of the weaker-willed students dropped to their knees, eyes locked on Izuku as he crouched on the wall, Hagakure in his arms as he looked down at them almost imperiously. "There is no danger," he said simply, without raising his voice too far beyond making sure he'd be heard by those in the back. "It is simply the press, who have somehow managed to bypass the defenses. The faculty will deal with them shortly. So we are going to, in an orderly fashion, walk out to the designated meeting areas, and wait patiently for our teachers to come get us." The or else, went unsaid, but understood by everyone there. Izuku let his eyes trail along the student body, who were all staring at him, some sweating a bit while others, male and female, were blushing slightly. Then he let the technique go, dropping to the ground immediately after, the students underneath him quickly giving him space. With one last glance at the students he turned, still holding Hagakure, and walked out the door, the rest of the teens following him much more calmly now, even as they began murmuring to each other about what had just happened. In the very back of the crowd of students, 3 third years stood and watched as the hallway began to empty. "Whoa, that was so cool," the only girl of the group said in amazement, bouncing lightly in place in a way that would have been a great distraction to some of the more hormonal of her peers. "Do you think that was his quirk? But then how did he stick to the wall? Do you think he could teach people how to do that? Do you think he's nice? I bet he's nice." Another teen was standing facing the wall, though he was trembling slightly in obvious fear. "That was terrifying. Yet you remained standing. I saw a bunch of students fall to their knees after that. I told you that you're stronger than you think," the last of the trio said. The boy he was addressing turned to him. "What do you think, Mirio-kun?" Tagata Mirio smiled brightly. "I wanna know more." After the excitement of the press's invasion, the day went mostly back to normal. The students discussed what had happened in the minutes between classes, speculating as to how the reporters had gotten onto the grounds and what UA would do to both increase security and punish the trespassers. One of the bigger topics of discussion had, as much as it annoyed him, been Izuku's actions and abilities. He'd known he would come under some scrutiny after what he did despite his attempt to keep the effects of Kami no Sabaki toned down. No one had approached him to ask about it, yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. He could only assume that his classmates all thought it was part of his quirk, but that was also making them more curious as to what his quirk exactly was, and he knew they'd be bugging him about it eventually. Hagakure had been a bit silent after what happened, fidgeting nervously whenever he was near. When Izuku wasn't paying attention, Ashido had held a hand up to where Hagakure's head was before jokingly exclaiming with a teasing grin that she could feel the heat of Hagakure's blush, prompting the invisible girl to whine at the other girl as some of the other students laughed good-naturedly at her embarrassment. Once the school day ended, Izuku was making his way towards a nearby classroom with Yaoyorozu at his side, finally being able to make the request he'd meant to at lunch. "This is a good idea," the beautiful heroine in training said with a smile as she walked with him. "I wish I had considered it, but I'm ashamed to admit that I haven't given our sister class much thought." "I suppose that's why you were chosen as class representative." "I chose you, you know," he said with a smile of his own, watching her blink in surprise. "I figured you'd do well in the job due to your diligence, intelligence, and willingness to help your classmates, perhaps with Iida-kun as the vice for his organizational skills." The ponytailed girl blushed lightly before looking down with a small smile on her face. "Thank you, Midoriya-kun. I appreciate the vote of confidence." Izuku stopped in front of the door to Class 1B and knocked on it as his companion composed herself. The door was opened by an attractive girl with ginger hair in a high-side ponytail and teal eyes. "Yes?" she asked as she shouldered her bag, obviously getting ready to leave. "Hello," Izuku said with a smile. "I'm Midoriya Izuku, class representative of 1A, and this is my vice rep, Yaoyorozu Momo. We figured we'd come and introduce ourselves to our counterparts here in the rest of our sister class, if possible." The girl blinked for a moment before a smile spread across her face. "Ah, good idea. I'm actually the Class 1B representative, Kendo Itsuka. My vice is Shota Narangeki." She turned back to her classmates and called out, "Shota-kun, could you come here please?" The boy that approached was stocky, which made him seem shorter than he was, with whitish blue hair and a round face. "Yes." Kendo smiled. "These are our fellow representative and vice representative from 1A. Her words caught the attention of her classmates, who turned to look at Izuku and Yaoyorozu with interest. "Ah," Shota bowed lightly. "Nice to meet you." Before anything else could be said, another pretty girl with blonde hair and somewhat animalistic features approached with a smile, the two long horns on top of her head adding to her height. "Hello," she said in somewhat halting Japanese, indicating she was a foreigner. "It's nice to Meet you. I am. Pony Suno, I mean, Sunotori Pony. Do you want me kick your ass? She asked, smiling sweetly. Izuku raised an eyebrow at that as Kendo sighed. Please forgive her. Sunotori-chan is from America and doesn't have a great grasp of Japanese yet, so certain people, she turned to glare at a blonde boy who turned away innocently, have been teaching her some incorrect phrases to use. Ah, Izuku said, nodding in understanding before turning to the innocent girl who was looking at him with big blue eyes. It's nice to meet you, Pony, he said in English, much to the surprise of his schoolmates and Sunotori's obvious delight. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I'm not interested in getting my ass kicked at the moment. Oh wow, you speak English so well, the blonde said, clapping happily and bouncing in place. Then she frowned. Wait, what do you mean? I'm afraid you just asked me if I wanted you to kick my ass. Izuku said gently. Don't worry, I know you didn't mean anything by it. I'm so sorry, she exclaimed, bringing her hands to her mouth. I just said it the way Monoma told me to. She looked down at the floor, her face showing a bit of hurt, which made the vast majority of the class who got the gist of what she was saying turn to glare at the boy that had to be Monoma, who turned away a bit nervously. Izuku rested a hand comfortingly on the girl's shoulder, figuring she might appreciate the friendly contact as an American in a Japanese school. Like I said, don't worry about it. If you want I can help you with your Japanese a bit when we have a chance. Sunotori immediately brightened. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the offer. I wasn't aware you were so fluent at English, Yaoyorozu said, an impressed smile on her face. Izuku shrugged. I've made sure I'd have a broad knowledge base. You never know what might be useful. Then he turned to Kendo, a glint of interest in his eyes. By the way, you're a martial artist, right? Kendo looked taken aback. Yeah, I am. How did you know? It's the way you stand and move, Izuku said. It's not overt, but if you know what to look for it's easy to spot. What style? Kendo was looking at her fellow representative with intrigue now. It's a mixture of Goju Ryu and Shito Ryu karate. What do you practice? She asked, as it was obvious he had to practice something, and be quite high level, if he was able to recognize the fact she did just from her stance and movements. It's a practically unknown style called Anything Goes. It's meant to incorporate the best of multiple styles into one. Izuku explained. I wouldn't mind sparring with you sometime, he said, a competitive glint in his eye, which was quickly reciprocated in Kendo's. Sounds good to me, the ginger-haired girl said, voice eager. Yaoyorozu studied the two teens as they stared at each other competitively, a finger tapping her lips. Midoriya-kun, if you think you could handle more, I would not mind inviting 1B to join the lesson we'll be having tomorrow. Izuku blinked before turning to her, surprised. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to impose, especially if you don't have the space. Space is not an issue, and I think you have the right idea about getting to know our schoolmates better. This can only help. Then she turned to Kendo. Midoriya-kun has offered to teach Class 1A some martial arts at my house to help us all improve. If you and your classmates would like to join us, I wouldn't be opposed. Kendo's eyes lit up, a smile appearing on her face, but Narengeki spoke for the first time since the introductions. I'm sorry, Midoriya-san, but are you qualified to teach, even if it's the basics? His tone made sure it was obvious that he wasn't insulting the brunette, just asking to make sure there wouldn't be any issues. Izuku smiled lightly. Let's just say I have some experience under my belt. Kendo and Narengeki exchanged a look before the class representative turned back to Izuku and Yaoyorozu, still smiling. I'll discuss it with my classmates, but at the least I'll definitely be there. Before anything else could be said, someone spoke from behind Izuku and Yaoyorozu. Midoriya-kun, Principal Nezu wants to see you. Izuku turned to find Midnight standing there, hand on her cocked hip. Neither Izuku nor his previous selves had had much of an interest in BDSM, at least not as a serious lifestyle. As something to occasionally spice up the bedroom, on the other hand, but Izuku had to admit that his teacher definitely pulled off the dominatrix look damn well. It was virtually impossible for anyone interested in women to not be affected. That went double for hormonal teens. Still, Izuku likely had more experience when it came to than most of the faculty combined, and plenty of self-control, so he focused on the woman's eyes and not her assets beyond a brief, involuntary glance. "May I ask why, sensei?" The beautiful woman cocked an eyebrow when she saw how he focused on her eyes after a momentary look a bit further south, mildly impressed. She was briefly tempted to tease him in order to get a reaction, but decided she'd rather not keep Nezu waiting. Teasing the greenette till he exploded, in more ways than one, could come later. "He didn't tell me, just that it was important, so I suggest you get a move on." Izuku bowed lightly to his teacher and said his farewells to his fellow students before beginning to head to the principal's office, all the while wondering why the Chimera wanted to speak with him. "Ah, thank you for coming so promptly, Midoriya-kun," Nezu said from where he sat behind his desk, 2 cups of steaming tea waiting. "Of course, Nezu-sensei." When the Chimera motioned towards the chair, Izuku took a seat and reached for the tea, blowing on it lightly before taking a sip, smiling in pleasure. "How can I help you?" "First of all, I would like to thank you for your actions during the lunch period." Nezu began once he'd taken a sip of his own tea. "Unfortunately, most of the staff was busy either dealing with the press or securing the school, but I reviewed the security footage and saw what you did. You saved that young lady's life." Izuku waved it off. "I'm just glad I was able to help. I'm lucky that I have a wide array of skills and experiences to use, otherwise it wouldn't have been quite so easy. That is the other reason I wished to speak with you," Nezu said as he pulled a folder over. "I wanted your insight and advice on our finding on how and why we were infiltrated." At the greenette's raised eyebrow, the principal chuckled. "You have seen things I can scarcely imagine, and as you said, have a wide array of talents and experience to call upon. I would be very foolish to neglect such a potential asset simply because of your biological age or status." He passed the folder over to Izuku, who opened it to look at the pictures inside. "That is how the press got onto the grounds," Nezu said more seriously now. Izuku studied the first picture, which showed the remains of one of UA's security gates, Power Loader and Smentos studying it. The gate itself, originally made of a strong, thick metal, was now just dust on the ground, as though something had made the thing rust at an accelerated rate. Izuku quickly ran through the powers and substances he knew of that could achieve such an effect, but most would have been easily noticeable. He looked up at Nezu once he'd gone through all the pictures, which showed different angles and close-ups of the gate's remains. "I assume you've checked the quirk registries of all the reporters that invaded to make sure none of them could have done this." "It was the first thing I did once I began my investigation," Nezu said with a nod. "All clean, unless they've been lying on their registries for decades." "Unlikely, but not impossible," Izuku murmured as he looked back at the pictures. "So whoever did this purposely let the reporters in and made it obvious as to how they did it. This was either a declaration of war, a distraction while they tried to accomplish some objective, or both." Nezu nodded in agreement, gaze serious. "Indeed. We performed a check of the school in case anything of importance was taken, but didn't find anything missing or out of place." Izuku set the pictures down and tapped his finger against the desk as he considered everything, a small, thoughtful frown on his face. "What about information? Were the databases accessed?" "Not as far as we were able to ascertain," Nezu responded. "I can't think of what they might have been after in our systems that they couldn't get somewhere else, however. I do assist with investigations and research on occasion, but I keep all my data on a separate, private server. We may boast that UA is high-end, but we are still, essentially, only a school. We shouldn't have anything too sensitive on our systems. Our true assets are our people, both students and faculty." Izuku's finger stopped tapping. "Then that's what they're after. Their focus is on the people, either in general or a specific individual." He looked back down at the pictures. "If this is a declaration of war, what better way to attack than at the students? Not to mention there are many high-profile heroes on staff who could be targets, especially now that All Might is here." Nezu sat back, humming thoughtfully. "It has merit. This could be a probing attack, to see how we react. They'd also need information to plan their next strike," Izuku said. "How easy is it to access the planned schedule?" The principal paused before quickly beginning to type at his computer as Izuku waited patiently. After several minutes Nezu sat back with a thoughtful frown. 13 was accessing it when the alarm sounded, likely to review the rescue training plan for the first years we will be conducting next week. It is entirely possible that someone could have seen it when the faculty office was vacated. Izuku sat back, letting his head tilt backward to look at the ceiling as he considered. You should increase security on all non-classroom activities where you can't just change the schedule entirely, and not just for heroics. What do you suggest? Nezu asked, reaching over to type again. Izuku thought it over for a few more moments before beginning to speak, and for the next hour or so the two discussed what could be done to prepare for any attack that might come. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.